Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a world where polished boots mattered, elbows never touched the table, and one rogue garden pea could destroy your entire social standing. It's the 18th century, and you're sitting stiff-backed under a dripping chandelier in a chilly English manner. The linen is starched, the soup has a name longer than your full address, and all you have to do is eat politely. Easy, right? Wrong. Because tonight's menu includes peas. Tiny, round, rebellious peas. And in this gilded, fork-fractured world, how you eat those peas, yes, peas, might just determine your future. That might sound ridiculous now, but in a dining room full of British aristocrats, everything is a performance. The tiniest slip of etiquette was like turning up in your underclothes. Only more humiliating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing our little sleepy history club stretching across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself seated between a baronet's fidgety cousin and a widowed marchioness whose expression suggests that she wants to disown someone for using the wrong fish fork. The air smells of roasted partridge, orange peel, and tension. And in front of you, nestled in a dainty porcelain bowl, are peas. Gleaming. Spherical. Malevolent. There's a fork beside your plate. A spoon nearby. A knife you're fairly sure is ornamental. The question isn't what to use, it's what does using each say about you. Across the table, someone drops a single pea. It rolls. It rolls with purpose. You watch it spin off a silver charger, hit the polished floor with a surprisingly assertive plink, and come to rest just under the foot of Lord Chisholm, who glares at it as though it insulted his lineage. No one laughs. No one blinks. The game has begun. Historians still argue whether this was an actual etiquette flashpoint, or just one of many miniature wars waged across drawing rooms and dining halls in Georgian Britain. But what's clear is that the pea, a vegetable once considered rustic, became a kind of edible landmine. In the centuries before this absurd showdown, the fork wasn't even invited to the party. Britain clung to spoons and knives like old friends, long after the rest of Europe had moved on. Forks were seen as foreign, frilly, almost sinful. The first English adopters were whispered about. Dandified, some said. Continentally corrupted, muttered others. But then, around the 1600s, things started to shift. Slowly. Nobles began experimenting. The Italian forks were daintier, cleaner, less likely to fling sauce into one's cravat. And by the 1700s, the fork had crept its way onto more tables. Not welcomed. Not trusted. But tolerated. And so when the fashion for garden peas, a luxury crop, fresh and green and grown with obsessive care, rose among the aristocracy, the question became urgent. How, pray tell, does one eat them without looking like a common field hand? Tonight, as you try to assemble 3 peas on your fork without triggering a mini avalanche, you're reenacting this very dilemma. Some say the fork alone should be used, delicately scooping. Others argue for the back of the fork method, pressing peas onto the fork's spine with a knife, then balancing them like circus performers. One footman it rolls, no, bounds, off the edge and strikes your butter knife with a treacherous little ting. Your seatmate stiffens. Somewhere, someone inhales sharply. You resist the urge to cry. But Lady Pennington, at the far end of the table, gently dabs her lips with her napkin, offers you the faintest of smiles, and says, a lively pea is better than a silent plate. There is, you realize, a sliver of mercy here. And humor. Some aristocrats weren't just aware of the absurdity, they relished it. The gamesmanship of it all. Mastering the peas was like mastering a waltz, or a sonnet. A way to prove you belong. Or at least, wouldn't embarrass yourself before dessert. The candlelight flickers. Someone coughs politely. You gather your courage and try again, this time using the spoon. You're instantly aware of the Marchioness watching. You feel judged. But also, relieved. It works. Peas behave for spoons. Is it defeat? Perhaps. But it's delicious. As you chew, soft bursts of green sweetness, you wonder why something so small could matter so much. The truth is, in a world of rigid titles and inherited power, etiquette was one of the few arenas where new money could shine and old money could stumble. A single pea could level the playing field. Or the table. You finish your portion with only minor chaos. 1 pea lost. 2 escape attempts thwarted. No lasting dishonor. It's a start. And just as you lay down your spoon, someone clinks their glass and murmurs, to refinement. However slippery it may be, the room exhales. A moment of shared absurdity. And suddenly it doesn't feel like a battle anymore. It feels like theater. With peas as props. And your dignity still, mostly, intact. You wake to a pale sun and the scent of damp hedgerows, England doing its best impression of enthusiasm. A light mist clings to the manor's windows, and somewhere in the kitchen, someone is furiously whisking cream, which seems entirely too ambitious for such an early hour. You pad downstairs, avoiding the third step on the left, which creaks like it's announcing secrets. The drawing room is quiet, all lace curtains and morning yawns, but someone's left the etiquette book open on the piano bench. You glance down. The proper employment of forks at table, 1743 edition. Of course. Today's lesson, how forks arrived in Britain, not with a bang, but with centuries of side-eye. You settle into a cushioned armchair, still warm from a recently departed body, and begin piecing it together, the long, awkward rise of the fork, the shy newcomer to the British dining scene. Long before it was forced to shepherd peas across trembling porcelain, the fork was considered deeply suspect. The ancient Greeks had them. The Byzantines made them elegant. The Italians? Well, they adored them, especially when handling their dangerously saucy pasta. But in Britain? Forks arrived like a misunderstood cousin from abroad, pointy, foreign, and thoroughly untrustworthy. Historians still argue whether it was fashion, trade, or sheer practicality that finally forced the British to embrace the fork. But one thing is clear, it didn't happen overnight. In the 1600s, many still considered the fork an unnecessary extravagance. Why use a metal prong when God had given you perfectly good fingers and an elaborately engraved spoon? Forks were seen as fussy, even effeminate. King James I reportedly mocked their use. They were continental, Catholic adjacent, suspicious by default. But the winds were changing. As trade with Italy increased and the aristocracy became more obsessed with foreign luxuries, forks began slipping onto Britain. You imagine the confusion of early adopters. Picture a gentleman at supper, gingerly lifting his fork with 2 fingers, stabbing a bit of trout, and hoping desperately that no one noticed his grip was more jousting than dining. It wasn't just the presence of forks that troubled people, it was how to hold them. Elbows, angles, pressure, pace. There were no rules yet, only expectations. And expectations, you've come to learn, are far more terrifying. One noblewoman, Lady Thistlewhite of Nottinghamshire, famously hosted a banquet in 1711 where forks were placed but not acknowledged. Guests were left to interpret their presence however they liked. What followed was nothing short of utensil anarchy. Some guests refused to touch them. Others used them backward. One poor baron reportedly used his as a kind of miniature back scratcher and was never invited again. It was chaos. Controlled, perfumed chaos. Eventually, as forks became normalized, so too did debates around their proper employment. Spoons still held their ground, especially for soups, stews, and soft puddings, but the fork began to reign supreme for anything solid and slippery. Which brings us back to peas. You glance toward the empty dining room and can still picture last night's battle. Forks trembling. Peas scattered. Politeness tested. It was never just about the fork. Or the peas. It was about who you were becoming while using them. Back in the day, to hold a fork with grace signaled worldliness. Taste. Modernity. To flail with one marked you as provincial. Possibly Scottish. Certainly not suited for duchesses or drawing rooms. There's an old rhyme tucked into one of the etiquette books, possibly written to help nervous children, or nervous social climbers. to dine with knife or spoon alone, is fit for beasts or those unknown. But those who seek the peerage's spark must wield their peas with silver fork. Catchy and terrifying. One fringe account you once heard involved a young viscount who practiced nightly with dried peas on his bedsheets. Fork in one hand, candle in the other, whispering to himself, "Balance. Balance." His valet, concerned, eventually swapped the peas for beans. It didn't help. And yet, something shifted in the early 18th century. The fork wasn't just tolerated. It was expected. More importantly, the way one used a fork became a kind of performance art. And like all performances, there were critiques. One social columnist wrote in 1737, "Lord R. holds his fork as though it were a pen, and his peas, the ink. It is a messy and self-congratulatory affair." Ouch. In contrast, Lady Susanna Draycott, widow and legend, was once described as the only woman in Devon who could spear a pea with a glance and a glint of silver. And thus, the humble fork became a litmus test. Are you delicate or forceful? Cultured or crude? Fork forward or spoon-bound? You rise from the chair and wander into the breakfast room, where someone has already laid out a simple spread: toast, jam, a bowl of pale, trembling eggs, and a suspiciously large pile of peas. Leftovers? A joke? A challenge? You don't ask. You simply take a seat, select your fork, and breathe. This time, the room is quiet. No chandeliers. No judgment. You try the side scoop method. 1, 2, 3 peas nestle neatly. It's satisfying. Almost meditative. Maybe forks aren't so bad. And maybe, just maybe, you're beginning to understand why they inspired so many squabbles, sonnets, and social titropes. Because in a world built on appearances, sometimes all it takes to start a war is, later that afternoon, you find yourself strolling down a gravel path behind the manor, boots crunching rhythmically as you pass hedges shaped like overly ambitious animals and roses named after people no one remembers. The sun peeks through a hesitant sky, and from somewhere nearby, you hear the soft thwack of croquet balls and a murmured disagreement over whether a wicket strike counts if someone meant to miss. It's all very proper. Very managed. Until you reach the garden terrace. Here, a table has been laid for tea, and standing around it are 3 ladies and 2 gentlemen, all armed with porcelain plates and varying degrees of utensil-based judgment. At the center of the table, a silver dish of buttered peas. Again. But this time, the mood is sharper. You loiter politely by the edge of the rose trellis and listen. One lady, draped in soft greens with a laugh like tinkling glass, says gently, "I do believe the spoon is perfectly respectable. Why, even her grace uses one." To which a mustached gentleman scoffs, "Because she's nearly blind and cannot see where her peas have gone." It's a pity, not an endorsement. Another woman, younger, with impossibly upright posture, chimes in, "Father insists on the knife and fork method. He says the back of the fork teaches patience and humility." "Your father," says the first woman with a tight smile, "also believed in bloodletting during hay fever." Tension thickens like clotted cream. It's here, amid clinking china and passive-aggressive pleasantries, that you realize something vital. Peas weren't just a food. They were a test. A small, buttery battlefield on which reputations were forged, friendships tested, and marital prospects quietly appraised. The slipperiness wasn't the point. It was the opportunity to demonstrate mastery over chaos, to balance delicacy with discipline. Historians still argue whether this obsession with peas was genuinely class-driven or just one of those eccentric fixations the British upper crust so enjoyed. But across letters, diaries, and etiquette manuals, one pattern emerges: peas made people nervous. It didn't help that garden peas, petits pois, if you wanted to show off, were relatively new arrivals to aristocratic tables. Once a humble staple, they were elevated by royal favor and hothouse cultivation into gourmet delicacies. To serve peas freshly shelled was to flex your wealth. To eat them poorly was to reveal you hadn't been born to it. One record from 1765 tells of a dinner guest who, upon dropping a spoonful of peas onto a lace tablecloth, offered to pay for its cleaning. The host simply said, "Sir, that cloth was made in Brussels. It costs more than your horse." No one laughed. Pea trauma was real. You imagine being a young noble dragged to supper with the in-laws, praying the peas stay put. Some, like Lord Granville's youngest son, reportedly practiced with lead pellets and a pewter fork every morning. Others hired tutors. Entire lessons built around wrist posture, utensil angle, and, most crucially, facial neutrality in the event of rogue peas. The performance had to be seamless. To pause, grimace, or, heaven forbid, chase a rolling pea with your finger was to invite subtle ruin. You recall a peculiar entry from Lady Hargrave's memoir, where she describes the moment her cousin was deemed unsuitable for court after he sucked a runaway pea off his thumb during luncheon. They never looked at him the same, she wrote, and he eventually moved to Bath, where expectations were lower. Some say Bath was where dropped peas went to heal. At the tea table, the debate winds down as one of the gentlemen discreetly scoops his peas with a spoon while pretending to adjust his cuff. No one comments. The moment passes like a phantom cough. You step away before anyone tries to rope you into choosing sides. Further down the garden path, a stone bench overlooks a pond, where two swans are circling each other like very polite enemies. You sit, the scent of lavender rising in waves, and think about all the effort poured into dining grace. It's not just peas, of course. The same level of scrutiny applied to fish bones, sauce handling, finger bowls. But there's something uniquely theatrical about the peas. Their roundness. Their rebellion. The fact that they seem to actively dislike staying where they're told. One fringe theory from an etiquette historian proposes that the real reason peas became such a battleground was that they offered a visible moment of etiquette. Unlike chewing or posture, which could be hidden or faked, peas performed. They rolled. They escaped. They spotlighted your precision, or lack thereof. A successful forkful of peas wasn't just good manners. It was a victory. And in some homes, it earned genuine applause. An old note survives from a viscountess who hosted pea evenings, quiet dinner parties where the vegetables were intentionally overbuttered, and guests competed to see who could finish their serving with the fewest losses. You imagine a room of elegant people watching each other with hawk-like attention, peas trembling on silver tines, the stakes somehow both laughable and immense. At least once, a guest slipped a bit of wax under their peas to help them grip better. He was banned for life. Even cheating had its etiquette. And for all this effort, for all the spilled beans, or peas, rather, what remained, generation after generation, was this: a shared understanding that refinement wasn't about opulence. It was about control. Control over your body. Your impulses. Your desire to chase after that one traitorous pea rolling toward the hostess's embroidery. You sit quietly now, watching the pond ripple in the breeze, and wonder how many lifelong rivalries began over a dropped vegetable. And how many love stories started because two people managed to hold in laughter when the Duke's pea bounced off his signet ring and landed in a gravy boat. Because if you can laugh at dinner, together, and still eat your peas without scandal, that's probably love. By the time you return to the house, the air inside has shifted. Dinner preparations have begun, and a subtle tension winds through the corridors, cloaked not in dread, but in the curious calm of ritual. Cutlery clinks in far-off pantries. Footmen scurry past carrying silver, starch, and self-importance. Somewhere, a bell is ringing, not an alarm, not yet, but a polite reminder that another meal is approaching. Another opportunity to get it wrong. You pass through a sitting room where two ladies are examining place cards and frowning deeply, as though the fate of the empire rests on who sits to the left of Sir Geoffrey. You keep walking. Down a hallway lined with ancestral portraits, all severe brows and high collars, you eventually find your way to a small library, the kind of room that smells of aged paper, pipe smoke, and slightly bitter wisdom. A single lamp glows beside an armchair. And on the table? Another etiquette book. This one much newer. Domestic Graces for the 19th Century Household. You flip it open at random and land on a section so specific it almost makes you laugh. on the consumption of peas during company dinners. It begins. Though trifling in size and appearing meek, the garden pea, when mishandled, may betray even the most stately guest. You read on. Apparently, the spoon had by now fallen slightly out of favor. The fork had taken its place as the utensil of refinement, with one crucial stipulation: do not stab. Peas were to be coaxed, gathered gently, lifted with grace. Stabbing, the book claims, reveals a primal tendency best left to This was the era when entire paragraphs were devoted to the angle of your wrist, the tilt of your head when declining butter, and whether your butter knife should ever cross your bread plate. Answer: no, never, and not even in private. Peas were no exception. The handbook goes on to outline 3 acceptable methods. The push method, using the knife to gently press peas onto the back of the fork, then raising the fork horizontally to the mouth. Risky, but admired. The scoop and tilt, fork tines up, slightly angled. Gather several peas in a single motion, no pushing, no fuss. The modern man's technique, apparently. The hybrid glide, knife used as a herder, fork as a scooper, with constant awareness of symmetry. Only for the truly coordinated. Or French. You wonder how many evenings were spent practicing these maneuvers in front of small mirrors. How many governesses snapped fans against palm or thigh when their charges dared to treat peas like mere food. Historians still argue whether etiquette books reflected actual practice or simply projected a utopia of grace no one ever actually achieved. There's evidence that behind closed doors, even among the nobility, people slouched, slurped, and yes, used spoons. But in public, at dinner, under candlelight and scrutiny? The rules were gospel. And the garden pea, bless it, was the holiest of sacraments. As you close the book, you hear voices in the hallway, quiet, clipped, familiar. You peek out and spot 2 gentlemen you recognize from earlier conversations. One is holding a small silver fork like a weapon. The other has a teacup and a face that suggests deep skepticism. I'm only saying, the fork holder mutters, the back of the fork is more stable. Gravity favors the curve. It's simple physics. To use a knife to push food, says the other, is tantamount to hurting sheep with a fencing foil. Absurd. It's just not done. They disappear around the corner before you can catch more, but the phrase not done lingers. It always does. You return to the chair, suddenly aware that most of these arguments, centuries old, have no clear winner. Because they were never about the peas. Not really. They were about showing you belong. That you were in. That you knew which way the current etiquette winds were blowing and could float along with them, fork first. But the problem with etiquette, as you've come to see, is that it keeps changing. In the 17th century, forks were foreign. In the 18th, forks were fashionable. In the 19th, forks were mandatory. But only if you used them exactly as prescribed by people who had never spilled anything in their lives. And through all of it, the pea rolled on. Oblivious. Unconcerned. Just doing what peas do best, falling off things. You stand, stretch, and decide to visit the butler's pantry. A forbidden little adventure, perhaps, but you're a sleep-deprived guest in a fictional world. Perks. In the pantry, silver is laid out like surgical instruments. Gleaming rows of forks, each slightly different. Some with longer tines, others with curved backs. Beside them, a tray of spoons labeled for soup, custard, and cowards. You suppress a laugh. Someone here has a sense of humor. You ask the butler, a tall man with a face like wet parchment, if he's ever seen a true pea disaster. His mouth twitches. Just slightly. There was a Marchioness of Exeter, he says slowly, who once attempted to impress a foreign dignitary by eating peas with chopsticks. Dropped 3 in her décolletage. One emerged during a waltz. You blink. And? She married the dignitary. Well then? You leave the pantry feeling oddly optimistic. Because if rogue peas can lead to love, maybe there's hope for everyone. Dinner begins again that evening with predictable splendor. The same gilded plates. The same cautious tension. Only this time, when the peas arrive, and they always do, you meet them with a quiet, practiced calm. You choose your method. You gather. You balance. One rolls. You let it go. It rolls off the plate, onto the cloth, and comes to rest beside your napkin. You ignore it. A second follows. You raise an eyebrow. Then a third. Now it's personal. But before you act, Lady Pennington, our patron saint of dining mishaps, leans slightly in your direction and says, with a smile, "Three's a conversation. Any more, and it's mutiny." You both laugh. Softly. Discreetly. But the tension breaks. You gather the rest. With grace. Or at least, with passable dignity. Because in this house, peas don't just test your etiquette. They reveal your composure. And maybe, if you're lucky, they remind you that even the most absurd rules carry a little truth. That kindness matters more than correctness. That poise is more than posture. And that laughter, however quiet, is the best utensil of all. The morning after the Great Pea Truce, because let's be honest, any dinner without utensil-related duels is a triumph, you find yourself wandering the Manor's portrait gallery. The room is long and drafty, and each wall groans beneath the collective gaze of generations of painted ancestors, most of whom appear to be judging your current hairstyle. They all have that same aristocratic expression, somewhere between mild constipation and intense suspicion. One particularly stern fellow with mud chops large enough to store small secrets catches your eye. His plaque reads, Sir Percival Bramley, 4th Earl of Northfield. Patron of culinary decorum. 1812 to 1884. Beneath it, someone has scribbled in faint pencil, Inventor of the pea ramp? You smile. The so-called pea ramp is one of those delightful footnotes in British etiquette lore, an innovation so ludicrously niche, it can only be real. Here's how it worked. Instead of struggling to balance peas directly onto the back of a fork, some clever, or desperate, diners began using their knife, not to stab, of course, because heavens no, but to press and nudge the peas up onto the fork in a controlled, angled fashion. A sort of utensil-to-utensil transfer. A mechanical collaboration. Naturally, this stirred enormous controversy. Was it dignified? Efficient? An affront to God? Historians still argue whether the technique originated with Sir Percival himself or merely became popular thanks to his absurdly detailed dinner journals, in which he annotated every meal with notes like 8 peas successfully rallied. Minimal slippage. Lady Whittlesey scowled, envy, I suspect. You like to think he really wrote that. Either way, the method became known, informally at first, as ramping. And like all social innovations, it divided the room. Fork purists called it cowardice. Spoon sympathizers rolled their eyes and said, see? Told you. But some embraced it. Quietly. Carefully. Especially those with shaky hands or less than noble reflexes. You walk further into the gallery and find another oil painting, this time of a rather severe-looking woman holding a lace fan and what appears to be a fork mid-tilt. The placard simply reads, Countess Eleanor of Swithin, never lost a pea. You silently salute her. The thing is, everyone seemed to have their strategy. Some angled their forks slightly outward, away from the plate's center, creating a sort of gravity-assist motion. Others turned their forks back. You leave the gallery and head to the breakfast room. It's mostly empty except for an elderly gentleman, sipping something that looks like disappointment mixed with milk. You recognize him vaguely. Lord Elbridge, possibly. He nods once and gestures toward the chair opposite his. Young people these days, he mutters, flinging peas about like pistol shot. You nod solemnly. Unforgivable. He leans forward, tapping his cane against the side of the table. Used to be, we practiced. Peas were a test. A moral crucible. You could tell everything about a man from how he handled the little green devils. Everything? You ask? Well, most things, he admits. At least whether he'd make a decent husband or a dangerous luncheon guest. There's a pause. Then he says, tell me, do you ramp? It's a serious question. You weigh your answer carefully, as though revealing your method might trigger a duel at 10 paces. Only when necessary, you say at last. He nods again. Slowly. Good. Never trust a man who ramps before he must. And just like that, you're initiated. He tells you stories then, softly, with the unhurried cadence of a man who has spent too long in rooms where no one listens. About the time he witnessed a fork duel over peas in Sussex. About a dinner where a duchess accidentally tipped her plate to gather the last peas into one cooperative pile. About how, for years, society papers would include subtle jabs. Lord A. dined with Lady B. this week. We hear the peas remained undisturbed. All very coded. All very British. As the morning sun stretches itself across the patterned wallpaper, you begin to realize something strange. This isn't just dinner etiquette. It's theater. Drama. A kind of edible diplomacy. The table, for all its formality, is a stage. And the peas? The props. The unpredictable, rolling test of who you are under pressure. Even footmen, you learn, had opinions. A former valet once wrote in his memoirs, I knew the ladies' suitors by their posture, and their peas. One lad, handsome as the day was long, chased a rogue pea with his thumb. Gone by the following Tuesday. You imagine the heartbreak. The whispered rejection. I'm sorry, George. It's not you, it's your technique. And what about the women? Well, they had their codes too. Some used the fork with alarming confidence. Some daintily avoided peas altogether, pretending to dislike them to avoid the risk. Some made a point of mastering them, performing their proficiency as flirtation. In one particularly juicy letter, a young woman describes watching her rival drop 3 peas in a row, then murmur cursed spheres under her breath. Scandalous. But oddly sympathetic. Because really, who among us hasn't cursed a pea? You finish breakfast, toast, eggs, a modestly restrained serving of non-rolling fruit, and make your way to the garden. The air is crisp now, smelling of moss and smoke and the kind of grass that's trimmed with more ceremony than need. You sit on a stone bench and watch 2 squirrels squabble over a nut. They have no use for forks. No etiquette books. And yet, somehow, they manage. But we created a full-blown moral framework around the ingestion of peas. A system so elaborate that generations of nobles passed or failed unspoken tests before the soup even arrived. And yet, beneath all the silver and starch, you can't help but smile. Because it's ridiculous, yes. But it's also kind of wonderful. A shared absurdity. A language of manners whispered across time in every careful forkful. A slippery green reminder that sometimes the tiniest things are the ones we cling to most tightly, especially when everything else is out of our control. By mid-afternoon, the sky over the manor shifts from its typical pale gray to something approaching optimism. A rare English sunbeam drapes itself over the western lawn like a golden tablecloth nobody invited. Encouraged, the household begins to stir in that curious way only British country estates do, slowly, methodically, with just enough bustle to suggest movement without actual haste. And where do you find yourself? In the linen room. Not because you belong there, let's be clear, but because you followed the scent of lavender starch and the promise of a secret corner. And there, tucked between stacks of folded napkins so crisp they could slice ham, you find something intriguing, a slim, cloth-bound ledger. Refinements at table, notes from the staff of Crowthorne Hall. Oh yes. This isn't the kind of volume you'd find in a shop. No embossed cover. No family crest. Just neat, looping script and an air of delicious honesty. You sit cross-legged on the floor, linen pressing cool against your back, and begin to read. The first entries are mundane. Table polish ratios, glass wiping techniques, the exact angle at which a centerpiece flower must droop, hint, 17 degrees. But soon you find what you were hoping for. Peas and their perils. Now we're talking. Apparently, the staff kept detailed records of aristocratic pea handling strategies, noting everything from grip style to emotional fallout. One entry reads, Lady Thornton scooped with admirable grace. 2 peas lost, either acknowledged. Result, applause at dessert. Another, less flattering. Lord Winthrop attempted the knife-fork ramp, but overshot. Peas landed in Miss Lucy's lap. She claimed to be pleased but left early. Host blamed draft. But best of all is the entry titled Operation Silent Retrieval. It describes, in almost military detail, how footmen were trained to intercept rogue peas mid-fall without breaking posture or drawing attention. The method? A gloved hand just below the table edge, poised like a falcon. One swift sweep, followed by a discreet disposal into a hollow pocket sewn into the cuff. You laugh aloud, then quickly stop, because even the napkins seem to frown upon it. There's something deeply satisfying about learning these quiet backstage rituals. In the grand theater of aristocratic dining, everyone had a role, and the servants, far from invisible, were often the true masters of the script. You read on. It seems certain staff developed personal opinions about the diner's technique. One wrote, "The Baroness eats peas like she's defending her virtue. Tight posture, steely fork, 0 losses." Another mused, "If Master Reginald drops one more, I shall fashion him a pea bib." Harsh, but perhaps deserved. You pause here, imagining the sheer pressure of it all. Not just for the diners, but for everyone in the room. Every sound, every slip, a possible headline in the household gossip journal. Historians still argue whether these behind-the-scenes customs were widespread or unique to houses like Crowthorne. But letters, journals, and plenty of cheeky memoirs confirm it wasn't uncommon for staff to quietly grade the guests. In fact, some footmen reportedly developed entire rating systems. One such guide. 1 pea dropped equals acceptable. Blame butter. 2 peas equals mild embarrassment. Blame nerves. 3+ peas equals social warning. Blame foreign influence. Chasing with fingers equals immediate disqualification. Offer no more wine. Harsh? Perhaps. Fair? Mostly. You wonder what your score, because for all the ridiculousness, there's something undeniably human here. The desire to be seen as graceful. The hope of making something difficult look effortless. And the quiet comfort of knowing someone noticed, even if they were wearing a starch-stiffened uniform and holding a crumb tray. You close the book gently and place it back where you found it. A little older. A little wiser. And with significantly more respect for pea-handling footmen than you had when the day began. You make your way down the back corridor toward the servants' staircase, your footsteps muffled by threadbare runner rugs and thick air scented faintly of coal smoke and lemon wax. At the bottom, you pass the scullery, where a young kitchen boy is peeling potatoes with the look of someone doing penance for unknown crimes. He barely glances up, but you catch the faintest smirk when he says, "They're serving peas again tonight." You stop. Turn slowly. "How do you know?" He shrugs. "Mrs. Greaves always polishes the silver forks twice when there's peas." Of course. Even the polish gives it away. Later, you find yourself in the conservatory, sipping weak tea and watching a bee repeatedly attempt to pollinate a porcelain tulip. You think back to the book, the operations, the judgments, the wild determination to maintain order over something so perfectly unruly. Peas were never the enemy. They were the reveal. Of decorum. Of drama. Of hidden talent and hidden scorn. And perhaps most importantly, of connection. You imagine 2 guests, strangers, locking eyes across the table after a dropped pea makes a daring escape. One arches a brow. The other stifles a grin. In that moment, they understand each other completely. Not through words. Through peas. Because some days, it isn't the grand speeches or the dramatic flourishes that tell us who we are. It's how we recover from a runaway vegetable. And how kindly we watch someone else try. Dinner arrives again. Because, in a manner like this, dinner always arrives again. It's not so much a meal as a ritual, with courses choreographed like ballet and silence hanging in the air like a lace curtain, delicate, dignified, and prone to tearing under stress. You're seated at the end of the table this time, safe from the prime zones of scrutiny, but well within reach of the evening's most controversial topic, a new guest, introduced only as Lord Finchley, who reportedly prefers to mash his peas. You didn't even know this was an option. The very mention has caused multiple monocles to fog. You study the man in question. Early 40s, face like a softened walnut, and a mustache so perfectly curled it might have its own valet. He sits with the confident stillness of a man who has chosen violence, but in a very polite, very buttoned-up way. The first few courses pass with minimal incident, a consommé so clear it might be holy water, followed by pheasant en croûte with decorative puff pastry spirals that serve no earthly function. Conversation remains light, cautious, and aggressively pleasant. Then it happens. The peas arrive. A soft ripple of silence moves down the table like a well-bred shiver. Servants sweep in with porcelain dishes of buttered garden peas, gleaming in a thin coat of clarified defiance. The bowls are placed. The utensils gleam. And all eyes, subtly but unmistakably, shift to Finchley. He lifts his fork. Then his knife. No. Surely not. But yes, without hesitation, without apology, he uses the knife to press, flatten, his peas into a kind of green paste, collecting them at the side of his plate like someone making avocado toast out of sacrilege. A collective internal gasp. A champagne flute quivers. Across the room, someone clutches their pearls in a way that suggests they've practiced for just such an occasion. Historians still argue whether mashing peas was ever acceptable. Some claim it was once a practical method used by soldiers and invalids, those without the luxury of balance or time. Others argue it was a regional habit, the sort of thing done in Yorkshire kitchens but never admitted in polite Mayfair drawing rooms. But here and now, Finchley is making a statement. The mashed peas are scooped, no, shoveled, onto his fork and delivered to his mouth with the casual indifference of a man feeding coal into a furnace. You can almost hear Lady Pennington whispering, "Mashing is the beginning of madness." It's not just the act, it's the lack of tension. The way he seems so entirely at peace with his decision. It throws the whole table into subtle chaos. Across from you, a young gentleman who had clearly been practicing his ramp technique all afternoon now trembles visibly, his fork hovering midair. To your right, someone whispers, "Barbarian." To your left, someone else says, "Genius." And you? You're watching Finchley with something that might be admiration, or fear. He finishes his mashed peas, dabs his lips, sips his wine. Not a trace of regret. The table shifts around him like a tide trying to decide whether to sweep in or pull away. You manage your own peas with traditional technique, fork tilted, knife assisting, quiet grace. But all the while, you wonder, is this how it starts? Is this how conventions crumble? First the mashing, then the fingers, then, God help us, the spoon. An old etiquette manual you once read referred to mashed peas as culinary defeat. The moment one could no longer command the sphere, one surrendered to the smear. Yet here is Finchley, not defeated, but victorious. Self-assured. Utterly unconcerned with your judgment. In fact, he even speaks. "These peas are excellent," he says, to no one in particular, but with the volume of a man tossing a pebble into a still pond. Someone coughs. Someone else laughs nervously. You spot Lady Thistleton fanning herself with the speed of someone cooling inner turmoil. But here's the most shocking part. No one rebukes him. No one corrects, gasps aloud, or launches a counterattack with a ladle. The table absorbs the blow, adjusts its composure, and continues. In its own, quiet way, it's a revolution. Later, in the drawing room, as the air fills with murmured gossip and liquor-sweetened regrets, the event is dissected with surgical precision. Guests gather in small clusters, each with their own theory. "He's foreign educated," says one. "Probably learned that in Rome." "Or prison," says another. "His mother was Welsh, you know." One lady says simply, "I rather liked it. It was bold." Someone fetches the butler. "Is it true?" they ask. "Has he always done this?" The butler, unshakable, responds since his first visit. "He's quite consistent." You sip your drink and stare into the fireplace, watching the logs burn like forgotten napkin folds. There's something quietly thrilling about what you witnessed tonight. Not because you intend to mash your peas anytime soon, but because, just maybe, the point of etiquette isn't never to break the rules. It's knowing why the rule exists, and knowing what it means to break it. Because sometimes, perhaps, tradition isn't destroyed by revolution. It's softened, like peas under a knife. And so you retire that evening to your room, mind swirling with tiny green rebellions and silent silver forks. You brush your teeth, extinguish your candle, and climb into bed with one final thought. Finchley didn't just eat peas. He owned them. And whether that was brilliant or blasphemous, well, that's what tomorrow's gossip is for. The next morning arrives with a gentle drizzle, as if the sky itself needs time to process the events of last night's dinner. The manor is quieter than usual, the corridors heavy with post-scandal hush. Even the footfalls of the staff seem softer, as though no one dares disturb the lingering presence of mashed peas. You emerge from your room and are immediately handed a letter, folded crisply and sealed with wax that bears the unmistakable insignia of Lady Pennington, a spoon crossed with a lily. She invites you to join her for a walk. You know better than to refuse a Pennington summons. Minutes later, you're strolling along a gravel path through the garden, raindrops tapping leaves like soft applause. Lady Pennington, wrapped in a velvet shawl of unnecessary elegance, walks with the slow determination of a person who has just witnessed something deeply uncouth and refuses to let it slide. She begins without preamble. "I trust you noticed Lord Finchley's display last evening." You nod. "Hard to miss." She sighs. "The mashers. They've returned." You blink. "Returned?" "Yes. They were quite the problem in the 1870s. There was even a pamphlet circulated among the better households on the immorality of vegetable pulp." You try not to laugh. "Historians still argue whether that pamphlet was satire," she continues. "But I assure you, the sentiment was real." As the rain lightens to a mist, she recounts the brief but intense pea-mashing controversy of 1873. Apparently it began at a luncheon hosted by the Marchioness of Farringdon. A guest, a writer of middling fame and tremendous ego, mashed his peas with such enthusiasm that some flew into a decorative fern. No one recovered. What followed was a wave of anxious editorials in society papers. Debates flared. Dinner invitations were quietly rescinded. Rumors swirled of secret mash rooms in London restaurants where etiquette pariahs could eat peas in shameful peace. One etiquette columnist, writing under the pseudonym The Forked Quill, famously declared, "To mash a pea is to confess defeat. To serve mashed peas is to admit one's home is not a home, but a trough." A bit dramatic, even for Victorian standards. But the controversy had legs. Dueling dinner parties arose, one side upholding tradition, the other embracing modern efficiency. The split, Lady Pennington explains, even reached the royal court, where Queen Victoria reportedly forbade mashed peas at all state banquets. And just like that, the mashers were pushed underground. Until Finchley, you say? She narrows her eyes at the mention of his name. He wasn't even subtle. Didn't even glance around before he pressed. Bold. Or clueless. You walk a few more steps in silence. Then she asks quietly, "Do you mash?" It's the same question Lord Elbridge asked days earlier. But coming from Lady Pennington, it feels more loaded. Like answering incorrectly might lead to social exile, or worse, being seated next to the undercooked mutton at supper. "No," you say carefully. "But I respect those who do. It takes courage." She stops walking. Looks at you. Then, very slowly, she nods. "Interesting," she says. "Let's see how long that lasts." And with that ominous declaration, she pivots and returns to the manor, her boots clicking like punctuation marks. You're left alone with the rain, your thoughts, and a lingering sense that pea politics may be more complicated than you'd ever guessed. Back inside, you find yourself drawn once more to the library. Not the grand public one, but a smaller, dusty alcove you discover One chapter is dedicated entirely to culinary code switching, the quiet rebellion of guests who appeared to follow the rules, but subtly signaled disdain through their technique. For example, eating peas with too much precision? Mocking your host's rigidity. Eating them too casually? Signaling disinterest in the whole affair. Mashed, but sculpted into tidy piles? A thread wrapped in cream and butter. Etiquette, it seems, wasn't about rules, it was about nuance. Subtext. The unspoken messages delivered in a single bite. There's even an entry on a now-lost tactic called the slide, in which guests used a fingernail, discreetly, of course, to adjust peas onto the fork behind the cover of a wineglass. Rarely executed. Highly controversial. You think about all the dinners you've attended in your life. Modern, chaotic, friendly, rushed. The way people still judge table manners, even if no one says so. Napkin in lap? Check. Chew with mouth closed? Obviously. But there's something about the old rituals, this obsessive dance with peas, that starts to make sense. Not because it's important, but because it's intentional. In a world of chaos, the small rituals ground you. You scoop. You balance. You try not to embarrass yourself or anyone else. And when the inevitable rogue pea makes its bid for freedom, you smile, pause, and try again. You close the book. That evening, just before dinner, a note is slid under your door. No name. No seal. Just 2 words. Mash watch. You chuckle. It has begun. In the drawing room, guests cluster in hushed circles. Some talk about weather, others about horses, but all of it is code for one thing: will Finchley mash again? He enters fashionably late. He greets no one. And he sits without ceremony. The peas arrive with the lamb. The table holds its collective breath. And then, he lifts his fork. He lifts his knife. And he pauses. You feel the air tighten like a corset. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he sets the knife down and, using a textbook push method, coaxes a few peas onto the back of his fork. Gracefully. With intention. He eats them. He dabs his mouth. He says, delicious? And continues. Silence. Then, a ripple of relief. Or is it disappointment? Either way, no one speaks of it. But everyone feels it. The mashers may rise again. But tonight tradition holds. And you? You've never been more aware of your fork. You wake the next morning to the sound of light rain tapping the window panes, a kind of polite drizzle, the English sky doing its usual half-hearted impression of melancholy. Somewhere downstairs, silverware is clinking against porcelain in early rehearsal for breakfast. But in your room, there's only the quiet and the memory of last night's dinner. Finchley didn't mash. That singular fact now floats through the manor like ghostly news. He didn't mash, someone whispers as they pass the breakfast table. He used the fork like a gentleman, says another. And someone else, more dramatically, he's been reformed. You find this both fascinating and hilarious. Because here, amid the stately portraits and the scent of polished wood, peas remain the tiniest, most potent currency. Their role? To expose intent. To test etiquette. And now, apparently, to signal personal transformation. You descend the stairs and wander into the East Salon, where an older guest is already seated in a high-backed chair, reading a newspaper with the kind of frown usually reserved for tax changes and low-quality marmalade. You know him vaguely, Sir Ambrose Biddleton. A man known for his opinions, his perfectly symmetrical eyebrows, and his famous duel with a Russian count over the reform, he mutters. It has its uses. But I'll say this, the line between evolution and collapse is alarmingly thin. One moment you're adjusting technique. The next, someone's licking their fingers. You sip your tea. He continues, do you know, in 1868, Lady Worthington declared no utensils at all at her infamous Druidic garden party? Served the guests peas in leaf bowls. Encouraged them to connect with nature. What happened? You ask. Someone choked. No one mourned. You glance out the window, wondering how many dinner parties have ended in accidental rebellion. and how many rebels didn't even know they were rebelling. Historians still argue, Sir Ambrose adds, whether Lady Worthington was a visionary or simply drunk. He raises one eyebrow, so evenly it could level a table, and returns to his paper. You take your leave and wander down the hall, where a row of ancestral busts watches your progress like slightly disapproving librarians. You pause at the end of the corridor, where a velvet rope bars access to a narrow set of stairs. It's the North Tower. Off-limits. Which, of course, only makes it more inviting. You duck under the rope and climb. The stairs spiral upward in that uniquely British way that seems to resent your ankles. At the top, you push open a weathered oak door and find a study. Not grand. Not imposing. Just small. Round. Filled with dust and faded daylight. And in the center, a writing desk. On it, bound in cracked leather, is a ledger titled. On the table, personal records from the dining chair of Lord Redwick. You flip it open. The handwriting is precise, almost annoyingly elegant. And immediately you're drawn into a strange, wonderful diary, not of feelings or politics, but of peas. Lord Redwick, it seems, was obsessed. He recorded not only what was served at each dinner, but also how each guest handled their peas. June 2, 1855, Lady H. Drop 3, blamed the table's slope. I suspect nerves. July 9, 1856, Finchley's father attempted mash. Unsuccessful. Resulting paste clung to knife like guilt. August 14, 1857, used spoon. Foreign guest. Allowance made. The entries go on. There are ratings. Descriptions. Diagrams. A marginal sketch of something called the peace slide maneuver with annotations like effective but risky. He even developed a scoring system. 10 points. Perfect fork back scoop, no losses. 8 points. 1 loss, recovered with dignity. 6 points. Spoon usage, but elegant. 4 points. Mash with intention. 2 points. Mash with apology. 0 points. Finger retrieval. Exile recommended. It is, without doubt, the most unnecessary and delightful system you've ever seen. You imagine Lord Redwick hunched over his desk each night, carefully cataloging the social universe 1 pea at a time. A historian of habit. A curator of cutlery. And perhaps, a man who needed control. Because peas don't listen. They don't obey. They roll. They resist. And in that rebellion, maybe Redwick found something oddly comforting. A test that reset with every dinner. A problem always small enough to solve, even if the world outside the manor wasn't. You close the book gently, as if not to wake him, and make your way back down the stairs. As you pass through the hallway once more, the scent of midday baking follows you, something buttery and ill-advised. You step into the morning room, where a footman is laying out lunch menus on a silver tray. He glances at you and smiles just slightly. "We've added mushy peas today," he says. You imagine tonight's dinner. The hushed glances. The silent judgments. The carefully veiled reactions as peas arrive not as a test of balance, but as pudding. And in this, a new question arises. If everyone eats the same texture, how do you spot the rebels? You walk away wondering not whether Finchley has changed, but whether he's simply leveled the battlefield. And if so, what happens when there's nothing left to drop? You spend the hours before dinner in a state of low-level anticipation, the kind usually reserved for school plays, minor surgery, or surprise visits from that one aunt who brings her own condiments. The arrival of mushy peas on the evening menu has tilted the manor's emotional axis. No one says it aloud, of course, that would be vulgar, but the atmosphere is unmistakably frothy. By late afternoon, guests have begun forming little alliances in the conservatory and the tea room, each camp murmuring its own theory on what this all means. Is Lord Finchley doubling down? Is this a trap? Or is this, gasp, a trend? You eavesdrop with the practiced grace of someone who's both intrigued and pretending not to be. "I heard they were minted," whispers one lady, clutching her teacup like a talisman. "Mushy peas are for public houses," hisses another. "Not parlors with silk wallpaper." And then a third voice, cooler, sharper. Mushy peas are equality on a plate. No technique, no rank. Just peas. Reduced. That hush that follows is heavier than the clotted cream. You escape the tension and make your way out to the terrace. The evening sky is beginning to bruise with indigo, and somewhere in the hedges, a bird trills a nervous, warbling tune. You perch on a stone bench and let your mind wander. How did we get here? Once, peas were just peas. Now, they're battlegrounds. Identity cloaked in chlorophyll. A conflict of class, cutlery, and courage. And now, tonight, they arrive not rolling, not resisting, but already broken. Pre-mashed. Pulled obediently in a ceramic bowl. You think back to Lord Redwick's pea diary, and wonder how he would have scored this version. Would it be a 10, simply because no peas escaped? Or a 0, because nothing was left to challenge? Historians still argue whether the rise of mushy peas in the late 19th century was born of convenience, economy, or quiet rebellion. They appeared in northern industrial towns, hearty and humble, served with battered fish and eaten without fanfare. But when they began appearing on manor menus, it was clear something had shifted. The upper crust was, perhaps, softening, one vegetable at a time. And then, as the bell rings to announce the evening meal, you realize. This isn't just dinner. It's a referendum. You dress accordingly, nothing too bold, nothing that says I side with the mashers, but nothing that aligns you too obviously with the staunch back-of-the-fork crowd either. Neutral elegance. A Switzerland of wardrobe. The dining room is radiant as ever. Candlelight flickers against polished silver. Crystal shimmers with the effort of trying not to giggle. The guests take their seats with the reverence of choir members settling before the hymn. Tonight's menu card sits beside your plate, embossed and slightly smug. Main course. Roast duck with juniper glaze. Mushy peas, optional mint. Pome's Dauphinese. Waldorf salad. You can practically hear the silverware tightening. The soup comes and goes without incident. The duck arrives, sizzling gently, accompanied by potatoes so creamy they might require legal counsel. And then, the mushy peas. Each bowl, he raises one eyebrow, so lightly, so fractionally, you're not even sure it happened. Then he lifts a forkful and eats. Effortlessly. Like it's nothing. Like he's always known this was inevitable. Other guests follow, some hesitantly, some defiantly. You notice Lord Elbridge, once a champion of the classic scoop, poking at the peas with something close to heartbreak. Lady Pennington stares at her bowl for a long time before lifting a single forkful, tasting it, and muttering, "At least they're warm." And you? You lift a forkful and take a bite. The taste is lovely. Earthy, smooth, faintly sweet. The mint lingers just long enough to feel intentional. It is not a triumph of texture, but it is undeniably edible. You eat a bit more silently. Then you glance around the room. Something strange has happened. People are smiling, talking, relaxing. With the peas tamed, the pressure has dissolved. No more balancing acts. No more hidden judgment beneath silver arches. Just food. Shared. Peacefully. You realize something else, too. No one dropped a thing. No one lost a pea under the table or gasped when a fork betrayed them. There is nothing to chase. Nothing to prove. And for some, that's a relief. But for others? A loss. Because as comforting as it is to be free from judgment, there's something charming about the pageantry of it all. The clumsiness, the corrections, the whispered critiques from across the napkin. Peas, in their uncooperative form, gave us drama, story, tension, and yes, identity. Now they just lie there. Eaten. Finished. Forgotten. By dessert, apple tartlets with clotted cream, the room is practically giddy. Someone makes a joke about starting a Peas and Harmony Club. Someone else suggests a new motto for the household crest, in legumini veritas, in peas truth. It's clear the mushy peas have done their job. They've soothed. They've simplified. But as you walk back to your room, full and thoughtful, you can't help but feel the tiniest ache for the chaos. for the rolling green reminders that life, even in its daintiest forms, isn't always meant to stay in place. You lie down, the sound of the rain returning outside, and close your eyes. Tomorrow, perhaps, the peas will roll again. And if they do, you'll be ready. Fork in hand? Wrist angled just so. Because elegance, like a perfectly balanced pea, is always worth chasing. You wake with the distinct sensation of being part of something historic, not earth-shattering, perhaps, but enough to make a footnote in a very specific kind of social almanac. The great mushy pea debut has come and gone, leaving behind a trail of soft green unity, and ironically, a newfound hunger for contrast. Breakfast is served in the orangery, a room that smells faintly of citrus and ambition. It's not the usual affair. Someone swapped the tablecloths for embroidered runners, and fresh-cut peonies spill extravagantly from low ceramic bowls, clearly meant to say, "Last night happened, and we're fine." The guests file in slowly, each nodding with a sort of dazed civility. No one mentions the peas directly, but phrases like refreshing change and nice not to have to think too hard are muttered over teacups and lightly buttered crumpets. You take a seat next to Miss Lavinia Shrub, a quiet woman whose primary hobby seems to be intense observation followed by devastatingly accurate summaries. She slices her boiled egg with the efficiency of a surgeon and whispers they liked it. But now they're bored. You pause mid-bite. She nods toward the far end of the table. Look at Lady Pennington. She's sipping her Darjeeling. She thrived in the tension, Lavinia says, buttering her toast with surgical precision. Now there's harmony. And she doesn't know what to do with it. You sip your tea and ponder that. Could it be that the mushy peas, by removing the challenge, also removed the joy? Historians still argue whether etiquette was originally designed to unite or to divide. Some say it was a code of shared understanding, a way to smooth interactions and avoid conflict. Others believe it existed to separate, gently perhaps, but firmly, the refined from the uninitiated. And here, with the great equalizer served in a ramekin, the lines had blurred too far. Even the footmen seemed listless today. No stray peas to retrieve, no tactical maneuvers required. One of them is caught daydreaming and gently scolded by the butler, who mutters something about discipline declining with texture. After breakfast, you wander into the rose garden, where dew clings to petals like compliments that arrived too late. The birds are louder here, as if reclaiming their territory now that the dining room has gone quiet. There's a bench near the sundial where Lord Elbridge sits, staring at a crumpled menu card from last night. They went too far, he says when you approach. It's like replacing chess with checkers. You lose the elegance. The nuance. He smooths the card out and sighs. I dropped a pea once, you know. In front of the Queen Mother. Recovered it with a fingertip behind a linen napkin, and she winked at me. That was the proudest moment of my life. You're not sure whether to laugh or salute. Now, he continues, there's no test. Everyone's equal at the table. What's the point of being trained like a Swiss clock if the dinner doesn't ask anything of you? He hands you the card like a relic. You fold it and place it in your pocket. Elbridge stands slowly and says there will be a reckoning. These things never stay settled. He disappears down the path, muttering about pastry forks and the decline of Western civility. Later, in the small blue salon, aptly named for its upholstery and its prevailing emotional tone, you find Lady Pennington speaking in hushed tones to Sir Ambrose and a thin, fidgety man introduced only as Mr. Pexley, who looks like a sentient coat rack with anxiety issues. They fall silent when you enter. You pretend not to notice and busy yourself with a book titled Sauce Boats and the Psychology of Power, which turns out to be oddly riveting. From the corner of your eye, you see Pennington lean in and whisper something that makes Sir Ambrose frown so deeply his mustache disappears into his nose. Mr. Pexley nods too quickly and spills a bit of brandy on his glove. It's clear, they're planning something. And it probably involves peas. You leave before they notice your interest and head for the West Wing, a part of the house you've not yet explored. The corridors are narrower here, the rugs thinner, the portraits more experimental in expression. You find a door marked Silver Inventory, and behind it, rows of polished cutlery gleam beneath glass like sleeping soldiers. And there, Tucked beneath a stack of dessert forks is a slim, rolled parchment tied with ribbon. You unroll it carefully and discover a hand-drawn chart labeled P Protocol, revised, for use in times of unrest. It's magnificent. Tiered strategies based on guest temperament, P firmness, and political climate. Recommendations include: for tense dinners, use half-mashed peas to soothe without surrender. For mixed-class gatherings, offer spoon-optional service, observe reactions. For anarchic guests, introduce edamame as a decoy. Each tactic is labeled with names like the Windsor Detour or the Quiet Scoop. A note at the bottom reads, always remember, it's not about the pea. It's about who controls the pea. You sit on the floor and laugh softly. Because of course, there's a strategy document for pea-based diplomacy. You roll it back up and return it gently to its hiding place. That night, there's a noticeable shift in energy at dinner. The menus are presented with flourish. The guests are seated with care. Lady Pennington arrives wearing a brooch shaped suspiciously like a sprig of mint, and Finchley is nowhere to be seen. The first course is soup, watercress, with suspiciously pea-like undertones. You eat slowly, waiting. And when the main arrives, there it is. Peas. Whole. Firm. Gleaming. Unmashed. You glance around. A fork is lifted. A hand trembles. And someone, not you, thankfully, drops a pea. It rolls. Silently. Elegantly. Free. The footman is there in an instant, glove poised, recovery seamless. The table exhales. Balance has returned. Dinner ends with the kind of satisfied hush usually reserved for library reading rooms or the final chord of a well-rehearsed string quartet. Conversation trickles down into murmurs. Teacups are raised without clinking. Chairs scrape softly as guests begin to rise, not urgently, but with the air of people who've just survived a small storm and rather enjoyed it. Yes, the peas had returned in their natural, spherical form. Yes, one had made a bid for freedom. Yes, it had been spectacular. It darted off a dessert fork mid-sentence and landed on the polished floor with a sound so delicate it could have been mistaken for a thought. Everyone heard it. No one acknowledged it. And the footman, with the reflexes of a seasoned hawk, intercepted it before it touched another soul. It was beautiful. And so, the evening settles into that mellow state between digestion and decision-making. Some guests slip away to their rooms. Others migrate toward the drawing room, where someone is attempting a waltz on the pianoforte despite having fingers more suited to taxidermy. You wander, of course, because wandering is what one does in a house like this. Each hallway a whisper. Each rug a story. Eventually, you find yourself back in the conservatory, dimly lit now and thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and residual gossip. Seated near the orchid collection are two familiar faces, Lady Thistleton and Sir Ambrose Biddleton, deep in what appears to be a very serious game of cribbage and a much less serious argument about legume lineage. I'm telling you, Thistleton says, sliding a card with practiced elegance, peas were never meant to be democratic. And I'm telling you, says Ambrose, not looking up, they were brought to Britain by the Romans. And if anyone understood drama, it was the Romans. You approach cautiously. Didn't the Greeks cultivate them first? You offer gently, attempting neutrality. Ambrose looks up and smiles. Ah, our little diplomat. Thistleton waves her hand dismissively. Greeks, Romans, whoever? My point is that before all this nonsense with mushy peas, there was an order. A hierarchy. Now everyone thinks they can just serve them like porridge, Ambrose finishes for her, with a theatrical shudder. You sit and listen, letting their bickering wash over you like a warm bath of historical pettiness. Historians still argue, Thistleton mutters, whether the 18th century's shift from split peas to fresh peas was an agricultural revolution or a complete culinary collapse. You raise an eyebrow. She nods. Oh yes. It's in the Ladies' Companion to Competitive Supper Hosting, 1794 edition. Ambrose snorts. Which also suggested pears be boiled in vinegar and served with trout custard. Utter nonsense. The conversation veers into a debate on whether Edwardian sauceboats represented moral decline, and at some point, Lady Thistleton drops a particularly vivid anecdote. I once saw a man try to butter a single pea at table. There is a pause. You, Ambrose shakes his head solemnly. The courage. You all laugh. The air lightens. It's moments like this, frivolous and oddly specific, that make you feel anchored. Like the world beyond the manor, with its noise and rush and digital glare, has melted away. Here, the greatest scandal is a rolling vegetable. The deepest debate, cutlery technique. It's absurd. And it's perfect. Eventually, you rise and bid them good night. But as you head toward the stairs, something catches your eye. On a small side table, half tucked behind a dried hydrangea arrangement, is a folded piece of thick paper, like a menu, but without the house crest. You glance around. No one's watching. You pick it up. Across the top, in neat, looping ink, it reads, The P Summit, Agendas and Alliances. Oh yes. Beneath the title are columns, names, preferred method, known incidents, allegiances. It's a kind of dinner guest dossier, clearly updated over the past few days. You scan the entries. Lady Pennington, fork-back purist. Openly anti-mash. Suspected ringleader of utensil traditionalists. Lord Finchley, reformed masher. Suspect motives. Possible double agent. Sir Ambrose, neutral. Leans eccentric. Prone to anecdotal derailments. Miss Lavinia Shrub, observer. Sharp. Keeps score mentally. Dangerous if provoked. You, unknown stance. Floating voter. Key to balance. You pause. Key to balance? You laugh under your breath. But the note continues. In red ink this time, bolder, more urgent. Next dinner, potential for escalation. Pennington preparing something. May involve napkin positioning. You fold the paper and slip it into your pocket. Because now it's not just a dinner game, it's a narrative. And you're a character with a role. You continue up the stairs, past the portraits of long-dead ancestors who, no doubt, also judged each other silently over asparagus etiquette and port wine sniffing. In your room, the fire crackles softly. The sheets are turned down, and a single lavender macaron rests on your pillow, decadent and absurd. You sit on the edge of the bed, turn the paper over in your hands, and think. So much history, power, pride, all hidden in how a person handles their peas. You crawl under the covers. Close your eyes. And dream of forks and empires. Of rolling peas and raised eyebrows. Of whispered judgments and delicate rescues. And somewhere in the haze, a voice says, butter a pea, and you butter your legacy. You nod in your sleep. Naturally. Morning arrives with the rare glow of English sunshine, soft gold spilling through the curtains, as if the sky itself is offering a temporary apology for being so constantly damp. Birds chirp with the kind of optimism that's usually reserved for spring novels or very convincing weather forecasters. You stretch beneath the sheets, the memory of last night's discoveries still fresh in your mind. The dossier. The P Summit plans. The elegant handwriting identifying you, as the key to balance. No pressure. You rise and dress with care, opting for something that says unassuming confidant rather than secret society infiltrator. Downstairs, the manor hums with its usual rhythms, silverware clinks gently, chairs are nudged back into perfect alignment, and someone is arguing about marmalade ratios with the subtle ferocity of a solicitor on trial. In the breakfast room, you find Lavinia Shrub once more, perched by the window, nibbling toast, scanning the room like a hawk that shops at Fortnum and Mason. She sees you. Nods once. Then says, without preamble, they're planning a test tonight. You sit slowly. A test? A proper one. Something to draw everyone's positions out into the open. You glance at the footman refilling teapots and whisper, "How do you know?" She smiles faintly. Pexley talks in his sleep. You blink. "I share a wall," she explains. He muttered something about fork curvature ratios and gravy as a trap. I took notes. Of course she did. You sip your tea and let it steep through your thoughts. A test. At dinner. To expose loyalties. You suddenly feel like you're in a Regency spy novel where the deadliest weapon is a dessert spoon. The rest of the morning passes in a blur of polite conversation and discreet maneuvering. You spot Lady Pennington consulting a servant near the sideboard, her hand gesturing in swift little arcs, the universal language of subtle table sabotage. Lord Elbridge, meanwhile, is in the library with a stack of cookbooks, looking unnervingly determined. One of them is titled Symmetry and Sorcery, which raises several questions you don't have time to ask. By late afternoon, the tension is thick enough to slice with a butter knife, but only if you use the proper grip, naturally. You take a quiet walk through the herb garden to clear your head. Mint, rosemary, and thyme waft up from the neat beds like memory triggers from a very judgmental kitchen. You pause beside a small wrought iron bench and sit, eyes half closed, listening to bees and wondering how something as tiny as a pea became a barometer for social collapse. Historians still argue whether the fork's evolution in the 18th century truly democratized dining, or whether it merely gave the illusion of accessibility. Before then, diners often used spoons or knives alone. The introduction of the multi-tined fork created new rituals, new errors, and, most importantly, new ways to feel superior. Back at the manor, the dinner bell rings with the gentlest suggestion of doom. You dress. You descend. And this time, you feel it the moment you enter the dining room. The table has been lengthened. The candles are lit earlier than usual, their glow golden and conspiratorial. Each place is marked with a handwritten card, flourished initials, no titles. Even the name tags have abandoned hierarchy. You find your seat. And you see it. Tonight's main course, roast guinea fowl with green peppercorn juice, and peas. But not just any peas. These are dual-textured. Half whole, half mashed. Carefully divided on each plate into two crescent shapes, like twin moons of uncertainty. It's breathtaking. It's a trap. Lady Pennington raises her glass and offers a short toast. To flexibility, she says, with the mild smirk of someone who's never once bent a rule without cataloging it later. The meal begins. You watch. Across the table, Finchley regards his plate like a battlefield. Ambrose glances left, right, then boldly tackles the whole peas with a back-of-the-fork approach so traditional it may as well come with its own oil painting. Pexley panics and uses the edge of his knife to nudge some mashed peas toward the whole ones, perhaps hoping they'll blend and cancel each other out. It's chaos. Elegant, hushed, slow-motion chaos. And then it's your turn. You lift your fork. You pause. Because you realize, everyone is watching you. You are the neutral party. The swing vote. The diplomat. The Switzerland of supper. And now your technique will speak volumes. So you do what any sensible person caught between class warfare and side vegetables would do. You rotate the plate. Slightly. Gracefully. So that the mashed peas are now to the left, and the whole peas to the right. It's a neutral gesture, either favoring nor avoiding. A move of balance. Then you address the whole peas first. Back of the fork. Classic style. 1, 2, 3 scoop. Then a delicate bite. Next you transition to the mashed. No mashing necessary, of course, they're pre-softened. But you lift them without hesitation. A soft murmur moves down the table. It's subtle. Barely there. But unmistakably a ripple. A few others follow suit. Elbridge copies your rotation. Lavinia smiles as she lifts her spoon, yes, spoon, for the mashed half, making eye contact with Pennington as if daring her to object. And Pennington? She lowers her eyes. Then, slowly, uses her knife to gather a forkful of mashed peas. Delicately. Precisely. She eats them. And says nothing. But you see it in her face. Something's shifted. Not surrendered. Not yet. But softened. You finish your meal without drama. The fowl is exquisite. The just subtle. The peas, both kinds, disarmingly good. As dessert arrives, blackcurrant soufflé, impossibly tall, you realize that no one's arguing. No one's whispering. and no peas are escaping. The table is, for this moment, united. And it's because of a plate that dared to ask, why choose? As you retreat to the parlor afterward, you hear Pennington murmur to Finchley it was bold. The arrangement. And oddly symmetrical. He nods once. I thought so. You pass by Lavinia, who offers a discreet thumbs up behind her fan. You smile and press your palm to your chest with exaggerated gratitude. And that night, back in your room, you unfold the Peace Summit chart and add one new entry. Tonight's technique, both accepted. No casualties. Spirits high. Peace possible. You fold it up, slide it into the drawer, and settle into bed with the warm glow of a diplomat who has done nothing short of brokering harmony between dueling starches. Not bad for a guest without a title. Not bad at all. The next morning carries with it the hum of something different, a hum not of tension, but of momentum. The manor breathes a little easier today. The air is lighter. Even the footmen seem to walk with a bit more bounce, as though relieved not to be navigating rogue peas with the reflexes of wartime medics. You descend the stairs into what is now a strangely harmonious household. A place that, just a few days ago, had been divided along pea-based battle lines, is now unified in something resembling truce. Not surrender, no, too early for that. But truce. A temporary, flickering peace served warm with rosemary scones. In the breakfast room, you find Lady Pennington, already seated and halfway through her porridge. She looks up as you approach and gives you a nod, not the kind that says welcome, but the kind that says you passed the exam you didn't know you were taking. You sit. She delicately adds a spoonful of honey to her bowl and says, I read the chart. Your spine straightens slightly. She doesn't clarify which chart. She doesn't need to. It was fair, she continues. Measured. A touch poetic. That note about dueling starches. Did you write that? You nod slowly. She smiles, just a little. Quite good. There's a long pause. Then, it's not about the peas, you know. You nod again. It never was, she adds, stirring with something suspiciously close to fondness. It's about control. About effort. Anyone can eat. But to do it with precision? With care? That's what separates us from the mob. You almost reply with a joke, but something in her tone tells you this is as close to vulnerability as she gets. So instead you say, and yet the mob eats well. She tilts her head. True. But do they know when to put the spoon down? She stands then, gathers her gloves and hat, and leaves the room with a rustle of silk and latent metaphor. Across the room, Lavinia's shrub is buttering toast with the measured calm of a person who has already predicted the entire day. You join her, and she leans in. Pexley fainted this morning. You blink. What? Also, she continues, Finchley's taken up sketching. Keeps drawing peas in different emotional states. Emotional peas? One was titled Existential Guilt with Butter. Quite moving. The manor, it seems, is going through a collective softening. With the war of the peas at something of a standstill, or at least a simmer, the guests are rediscovering their personalities. Or in some cases, inventing new ones. Later that morning you're invited, well, strongly encouraged, to attend a small workshop hosted by Sir Ambrose titled The History of Silent Disapproval and Formal Dining. You go, naturally, because who could resist? It's held in the Blue Salon, where Ambrose stands beside a chalkboard and a rather distressed-looking mannequin dressed in mid-Edwardian attire. Disapproval, he begins, is best delivered with the eyes, never the mouth. He demonstrates. The glance downward, mild disappointment. The upward flick, betrayal. The prolonged blink? That's reserved for someone who says cutlery but means flatware. He's animated. Passionate. Slightly unhinged. You love every moment. Historians still argue, he says at one point, whether the Duchess of Marlborough's famed 1902 frown at the Paris embassy was directed at the undercooked pheasant, or her husband's sudden use of a left-handed bread tear. By the end of the session, everyone in the room is practicing eyebrow lifts and subtle head tilts like they're learning interpretive dance for a Wes Anderson film. You're getting very good at the half smile that says, "I've noticed your fork usage and silently judged you." Afterward, you walk the grounds with Finchley, who carries a small sketchbook and offers you a glimpse of his latest work, P. Regret in Sepia. It is oddly poignant. A single P, slightly flattened, next to a fork that looks almost ashamed of itself. "I think I'm processing something," he says, closing the book with great care. "All those years of mashing. Never asking why." You nod solemnly. "Do you think," he says after a beat, "there's redemption in reinvention?" You consider this. "Well," you reply, "you haven't mashed anything in days. And you've mastered the back scoop." He beams. "There's a whole series coming," he adds. P. Confessions. "I'm thinking oils." Back inside, the staff is preparing for tonight's dinner. You peek at the kitchen through a slightly ajar door and catch a glimpse of green puree being piped into pastry shells. P. Tartlets? Perhaps. Or perhaps something more strategic. You retreat to the library to think. There, hidden behind a stack of books with titles like Rhubarb, A Legacy and Forks of the Empire, you find a journal belonging to someone named R.H. Spindle, a past guest, judging by the tone. The first entry reads, "Day 1, was seated between a man who counted his peas and a woman who whispered the word butter like a threat." You read on. Spindle writes of etiquette games, of secret competitions, of an unspoken challenge where guests tried to invent entirely new techniques just to throw others off. One such method, the crescent push, where peas are gently herded in a moon shape toward the fork, then tilted in with a spoon in a dramatic flourish. It was reportedly banned after Lady Wexford's monocle flew into the consommé in 1883. Another, the reverse rake, in which the knife becomes a subtle rake, gathering peas into fork cradles like a gardener gathering wayward seeds. Absurd. Delightful. And possibly dangerous. You close the journal, heart warmed and brain buzzing. Because it's not just the present manor guests who've danced this dance. This has happened for generations. Peas as pretext. Manners as masquerade. And beneath it all, people just trying to figure out how to be themselves at a table that keeps changing shape. That night, as the candles are lit, and you take your seat for dinner, you notice something unusual. Instead, a small card sits on each plate. It reads, "Tonight, we eat without them. Let's see what remains." It's bold. Radical. P. Withdrawal. Lady Pennington raises her glass again. "To clarity," she says, voice clear. "And to every table that chooses stillness over struggle." No one speaks. And then, Lavinia, predictably, lifts her glass and murmurs, "And to peas, in absentia." A ripple of laughter. The meal begins. And for the first time in days, no one is performing. No scooping. No mashing. No glancing to see who drops what. Just quiet chewing. And maybe, just maybe, a little reflection. Later that evening, long after the candles have puddled into waxy sighs and the guests have retreated to parlors, nooks, and the mysterious billiards room no one seems to use, you find yourself wandering again, through corridors that creak with memory and up staircases that spiral with far more personality than they should. It's quiet, save for the distant clink of a teacup and the shuffle of someone too dignified to run but too curious to walk normally. You're thinking about the absence of peas. How strange it felt. How incomplete. Not because you missed the taste, though, let's admit, they do have a charming sweetness when done right, but because of what they represented. That dinner without them had felt somehow flat, like a conversation without subtext. A play with no second act. The little green spheres, it seems, had been doing more than filling the plate. They'd been filling the space between people. You step into the music room, a dark, velvety space where a harp looms in the corner like a sleeping spider, and the piano keeps its keys pressed together in aristocratic silence. On a side table sits a silver tray of untouched walnut biscuits and a glass of something amber left behind by a careless guest or an optimistic butler. There, beside the glass, is a folded piece of parchment. Because of course there is. You unfold it carefully and read, in looping script. To be or not to be, the evening's fallout. Underneath is a list, anonymous observations from around the table. Tiny thoughts. Glimpses. Reactions captured in shorthand. Missed the challenge. Less judgment. Also less fun. My hand reached for them by instinct. Without peas, who even am I? You smile. Someone, perhaps multiple someones, have begun documenting the emotional aftermath of their absence. You wonder if this is what it means to be human, missing the very things that once annoyed you most. Historians still argue whether table rituals evolve out of necessity or boredom. Was the Victorian preoccupation with asparagus tongs about hygiene, or simply a chance to show off? Did the Roman reclining dining style express status, or just indigestion avoidance? Either way, every culture finds its peas, the tiny challenges we dress in meaning. You wander further down the hallway and come to a heavy door marked game room. You've never seen it open. But tonight the knob yields. Inside, it's a world frozen in time. Tall cabinets hold box games with names like The Tact of the Table and Utensil Duel, the Regency Edition. A large board rests in the center of the room, beautifully carved and laid with marquetry. You step closer and see it's a kind of dining-themed game board. At each corner, a different approach to peas. Fork back formalist. Masher of tradition. Spoon subversive. The wild pickup artist. There are game pieces shaped like forks, knives, tiny peas carved from green-stained ivory. You notice a little deck of cards labeled Table Trials. You draw one at random. It reads, you sneeze mid-scoop and launch a pea into a duchess's sherry. Lose a turn. Another. You attempt to impress a marquis with you imagine the guests of yore, sitting here after supper, reenacting their own social faux pas with laughter and whispered scandal. Maybe this was the safe space, the room where you could admit that you once used a spoon, or that you buttered something you shouldn't have. You return the card to the deck and leave the room with a grin. As you pass the portrait gallery, you pause before an unusually small painting. It's not grand. No powdered wig. No military sash. Just a young woman, laughing, holding up a fork with one single pea balanced on it like a prize jewel. The plaque below reads, Lady Eugenia 1P Fairmont, 1798 to 1834. Known for her elegance, wit, and infuriating steadiness. You stand for a long moment. Then give her a small, respectful nod. Back in your room, there's a note waiting for you on your nightstand. Lavender-scented, heavy stock paper. Midnight. North Tower. Bring no utensils. No signature. No explanation. And naturally you go. Because by now, you understand that peas are never just peas. And when the North Tower calls, it's never casual. The air grows cooler as you ascend the spiral staircase. Each step creaks like an old friend trying to remember your name. At the top, the door opens with a gentle push, and you step into a softly lit room filled with cushions, low stools, and, at the center, a low round table. Seated around it, Pennington, Finchley, Lavinia, Ambrose, even Pexley, who looks like he's still recovering from his mirror incident. No one speaks at first. Then Finchley gestures to the center of the table. There, beneath a glass dome, is a small silver bowl. Inside, a single pea. Whole. Green. Glossy. Balanced on a silk napkin folded into a perfect triangle. Tonight, says Pennington, we decide what it meant. There's a pause. Then Ambrose clears his throat. It meant possibility. Lavinia adds, it meant control. Finchley whispers, it meant I was never taught the rules. You look at each of them. Then at the pea. And you say, maybe it just meant we were all trying. The silence that follows is warm. Comfortable. Pexley leans forward and lifts the dome. The scent of mint and lemon lingers. He picks up the pea, gently, reverently, and places it on a tiny gold plate. And everyone exhales. Because it's not about eating it. It never was. It's about seeing it. Acknowledging it. And sharing the same table while doing so. They rise one by one, nodding, silent agreements exchanged like heirlooms. You're the last to leave. As you turn back, you see the piece still resting on its little plate, untouched but no longer alone. It has become what all great symbols are. Simple. Silly. Sacred. Morning drapes itself over the manor like a shawl, quiet, warm, faintly embroidered with dew. You wake feeling not quite regal, but definitely adjacent to someone who might own a family crest involving a goose. There's a calm in your chest, as if last night's gathering in the North Tower pulled a thread through everyone and stitched a kind of gentle understanding. Still, questions linger. What now? With the War of the Peas in stalemate, or something softer than that, a polite détente, the guest seems slightly disoriented. Breakfast feels less like a meal and more like a reunion after a shared dream. You sit next to Finchley, who is carefully sketching a new concept titled Pea in Reflection. He's drawing it as if it holds the answer to the human condition, which, here, it just might. You think it's over? He asks, and then, just as the toast arrives, perfectly golden, as always, a butler discreetly slides a small white envelope beside your plate. Plain. No crest. Just your name, handwritten in a script so delicate it looks embroidered. Inside is a card. You are invited to an exhibition of alternative techniques. Green parlor. 2 o'clock. Discretion preferred. You glance around, but no one seems surprised. Finchley is now drawing his P with a monocle. Pennington doesn't even blink. You nod slightly and pocket the card. Because of course you're going. At exactly 2, you make your way to the green parlor, a room you've seen in passing but never entered. It's sun-drenched and lined with velvet, the walls covered in paintings of vegetables so lifelike it feels vaguely accusatory. Waiting inside are 6 guests you know well by now: Lavinia, Pennington, Finchley, Ambrose, Pexley, somehow already flustered, and a newcomer, Lady Mirabelle Chanter, who arrived late last night under mysterious circumstances and is rumored to once have eaten soup with a seafood fork just to make a point. The table in the center is covered in green felt. Upon it, an array of implements that look like they belong in both a kitchen and a curiosity shop. There's a tiny ladle, a long-handled prong, something disturbingly similar to dental tongs, and a shallow silver scoop engraved with the phrase Carpe Pisum, seize the pea. Pennington clears her throat. Ladies and gentlemen, she begins, today we explore innovation. Ambrose nods as though this is the most obvious thing in the world. These methods, she continues, have been proposed by members of this house over the last week. Some are unconventional. Some are questionable. All are worthy of a hearing. You watch as each person steps forward with a tool or technique of their own. First, Lavinia presents the swirl method, a small circular motion with the back of the fork that supposedly corrals peas more efficiently while providing what she calls emotional satisfaction. It's about orbit, she says, demonstrating with a walnut as a stand-in. Peas respond to gravity and grace. Next is Ambrose with the twin-tine shuffle, where only 2 tines of the fork are used, almost like tweezers. It's delicate, he says, but it's also a test of restraint. Good for weeding out the vulgar. Finchley offers up the slide and tuck, which is less of a scoop and more of a gentle glide, followed by a subtle nudge from the index finger. Controversial, but oddly mesmerizing. Lady Chanter, elegant, remote, introduces the pivot and press, involving a spoon, a counterclockwise twist, and a dab of lemon oil for confidence. Everyone takes notes. You're not sure whether to be inspired or deeply worried. And then, with all eyes on you, Pennington gestures to the tools on the table. Your turn. You blink. I didn't bring a method. She smiles. Then invent one. You step forward slowly, heart thudding like a ballroom clock at midnight. You scan the tools. You glance at the plate of peas sitting patiently in the middle, waiting to be interpreted. And then it happens. You take the spoon. Not the fancy one with the scrollwork. A plain, unembellished silver spoon. And you scoop. Not with flair. Not with flourish. Just, simply. You lift the peas and say, I call it, eating. There's a beat of silence. And then Lavinia claps. Once. Then again. Ambrose chuckles. Pennington tilts her head, as if both surprised and mildly offended. Finchley writes, A declaration that sometimes, in the theater of dining, simplicity is the most radical act. Later, over tea, Lady Chanter confides that she once saw a man eat peas with his fingers and didn't speak for 2 weeks out of sheer confusion. You thank her for the warning. Dinner that evening is subdued, but contented. Peas are present, of course. A quiet half-mash with parsley. They sit on the plate like an old friend who no longer needs to impress you. There is no commentary. No judgment. Just conversation about weather patterns, a new opera involving a haunted harpsichord, and a brief debate over whether rhubarb constitutes a dessert or a threat. You eat slowly. And as you lift your spoon, unapologetic and unadorned, you feel something settle. Peace? Perhaps. Or maybe just comfort. The kind that comes from no longer performing. The kind that says, I know who I am at this table. The next morning brings a drizzle so faint it could be mistaken for particularly ambitious fog. The manor windows blur with soft condensation, like the house is deep in thought, staring wistfully out at its own hedges. You descend to breakfast later than usual. The room is quieter than it's been in days, not solemn, exactly, but contemplative. As if everyone here has suddenly realized they've spent the last week emotionally entangled with a legume. Lavinia gives you a quiet nod from behind her teacup, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her saucer. Finchley is sketching again, though this time it's a spoon cradling a pea under starlight. He's titled at Stillness, Interrupted. Pexley enters with a noticeable limp, apparently having twisted his ankle trying to reenact the slide and tuck in his room with an apricot. His sense of dignity remains intact only because everyone silently agrees not to mention it. You settle into your chair, greeted by a plate of modestly poached eggs and, yes, another small ramekin of peas. They're back again. But not as test, not as symbol. Just as food. Pennington arrives last, draped in an eggplant-colored shawl that suggests either mourning or victory. She gives no speech. She simply eats, pauses, and says softly, "They're better this way." No one asks what this way means. Because somehow we all know. Later, a light schedule is posted on the hallway notice board, wedged between a handwritten poem about pickled onions and an invitation to Lord Elbridge's storytelling hour. It reads, Afternoon program, the drawing room. 2 o'clock, peer review, rejected P techniques. 3:15, embroidery circle, themes, spoons, forgiveness. 4 o'clock, pudding preview and gentle debates. 5:30, lawn silence, optional shawls provided. Of course, you attend all of it. At 2 o'clock sharp, the drawing room transforms into a kind of support group for overambitious utensil users. Finchley gives a dramatic retelling of his attempt at the left-handed dual wield, which left him winded and 3 peas short of a plate. Lavinia shares notes from her brief trial of pea pinching with pastry tweezers, which she describes as emotionally draining but oddly tender. Pennington confesses she once attempted to spear a single pea atop a crouton to demonstrate moral superiority. She concludes it worked. But I never felt lonelier. The group hums with low, amused empathy. Ambrose presents an illustrated scroll depicting the waltzing tine, a method involving rhythmically shifting one's fork to mimic dance steps. It is promptly banned for dizziness potential. Pexley attempts to explain a method he calls the vertical jab, but everyone votes unanimously to pretend they didn't hear him. At 3:15, the embroidery circle meets near the fireplace. The hum of stitching, Lavinia embroiders a fork with tears. Finchley attempts a philosophical plate. Ambrose gives up and starts sewing a trout. Pennington stitches a simple green dot and refuses to elaborate. At 4 o'clock, the pudding preview draws a larger crowd. There are murmurs over the syllabub, not syllabuby enough, and respectful awe toward a trifle so tall it requires structural support. Amid all this, a conversation blooms, not about etiquette, or rebellion, or even peas, but about why we care. Why we assign so much meaning to the little rituals. One guest suggests it's a way to assert identity in a world too big. Another thinks it's about beauty, finding moments to polish, even on a plate. Pennington offers, because we like knowing the rules. And we like knowing when it's safe to break them. Lavinia counters, or because we're all slightly afraid of eating wrong in front of someone we admire. Ambrose quietly adds, and because when everything else feels uncertain, a well-balanced fork feels like truth. Historians still argue whether formal dining evolved from necessity or drama. Some believe it was all about hygiene and avoiding shared platters. Others say it's performance, an elegant theater of spoons and posture, where the tiniest gestures reveal entire philosophies. Like how some civilizations used communal bowls and others built dining as personal arenas. At 5:30 you wrap yourself in a herringbone shawl and step out onto the lawn for the scheduled silence. Chairs have been set up in neat little arcs facing west, each with a cushion and a thermos of elderflower tea. Guests settle into their places, feet curled under, eyes scanning the slowly setting sun. And no one speaks. It's lovely. You notice that in the hush, things become clearer. The rustle of trees sounds intentional. A bird landing on the sundial feels like a punctuation mark. Someone sneezes 3 seats down and is handed a handkerchief with such gentle efficiency, it feels choreographed. You sip your tea and watch the light fade, thinking about all the noise that used to surround the idea of a single, green, garden-grown legume. And how, in the end, it never asked for any of it. It was we who projected meaning onto it. We who weaponized it. We who reconciled with it. And maybe that's all any of us are doing, finding little things to care about loudly enough that we forget we're fragile. Dinner that evening is served picnic-style, indoors, due to the damp lawn. Blankets are spread across the parquet floor of the great hall. Pillows are scattered. Shoes are optional. The meal is finger-friendly: roast chicken slices, fruit, crusty bread, and a bowl of lightly buttered peas with a note that reads simply, "Do as you will." You do. You eat them with your fingers, just 1 or 2. No one gasps. No one takes notes. Lavinia gives you a wink. Finchley gives you a toast. And Pennington? She smiles. Then picks one up between thumb and forefinger, pops it into her mouth, and says, surprisingly satisfying, "You grin?" Because this quiet revolution feels earned. Not through conflict, but through understanding. Through late-night whispers and embroidered spoons in green velvet parlors. And through realizing that sometimes, the right way to eat peas is the way that keeps you talking. Laughing. Connecting. You clean your plate. And for the first time, you don't wonder if you did it right. You sleep deeply that night, as if your very muscles have finally exhaled after days of social yoga. In your dreams, forks bend gently to your will, and peas orbit your plate like obedient planets. There is, notably, a dancing spoon in a cravat, but you decide not to unpack that particular image too much. By morning, the manor is abuzz, not with stress or scandal, but something sweeter: anticipation. Because today, apparently, is the long-awaited garden luncheon, an annual tradition that has been postponed twice due to excessive mist and once due to a rogue pheasant. You overhear the staff debating table arrangements over marmalade jars. Someone mentions themed parasols. Someone else mutters about last year's deviled egg disaster. You don't ask. After breakfast, a footman appears with a garment bag and a polite cough. For the luncheon, he says. You unzip it and reveal a perfectly tailored, slightly whimsical outfit in summer tones, something that whispers, "I know how to wield a dessert fork, but I'm not a tyrant about it." At noon, the garden transforms. Round tables dot the lawn like pastel mushrooms. There are floral centerpieces balanced on old cookbooks, linen napkins folded like swans, and chairs draped with patterned shawls in case of breeze-related shivering. Someone plays a cello near the gazebo. It's all a bit magical. And then, you spot it. Dead center of the head table sits a dish, covered in a gleaming silver cloche. No label. No scent. Just presence. You're seated beside Lavinia and across from Finchley, who has brought a portable watercolor kit just in case inspiration strikes mid-salad. Pennington arrives in a wide-brimmed hat that could double as a boat's sail, and Pexley hobbles unfashionably late with a walking stick that appears to be carved from asparagus. Again, you don't ask. Lady Chanter stands and offers a welcome speech that somehow references both Greek symposiums and her cousin's failed lemon tart empire. Then she unveils the dish beneath the cloche. A murmur goes around the table. Because it is, of course, peas. But not just any peas. These are deconstructed. A gentle pea mousse, a dollop of minted puree, 3 flash-fried whole peas dusted in sea salt, and, at the center, a single, unadorned pea. Naked. Whole. Glorious. The dish is called a journey. Everyone stares. Then Pennington lifts her spoon and tastes the mousse first. She closes her eyes. Exhales. Then reaches for the whole pea and places it on her tongue like communion. When her eyes open, she smiles, really smiles, and says, "Well, they've cracked it." Lavinia nods solemnly. It's not just a dish. It's a statement. Finchley is already painting it, dubbing the piece P Ascendant. You take your bite. It is, frankly, delicious. The mousse is airy, the puree smooth, the fried peas impossibly crisp. But it's that final, unembellished pea that lingers, a gentle reminder of where it all began. You look around and realize everyone is smiling. There is no tension. No posturing. Just chewing, and light conversation, and the occasional murmured MMM. Historians still argue whether food presentation reached its peak in the Edwardian era or during the Nouvelle Cuisine movement of the 1960s. Some claim that by making food beautiful, we alienate its purpose. Others argue that beauty is the purpose. But perhaps it's simpler than that. Perhaps food is the thing we use to talk when we don't know what to say. After the meal, there is a toast, spontaneous, soft, a little chaotic. Multiple glasses clink out of sync. Ambrose accidentally knocks his over and tries to play it off as interpretive expression. It works. Then Pennington stands. "No speeches," she says. "Just this. I've never enjoyed peas more." Everyone applauds, and it's not sarcastic. She steps down, patting your shoulder gently as she passes. Later, while guests nap in sun-drenched hammocks or debate whether fig jam is a condiment or a lifestyle, you and Lavinia stroll the far end of the garden where the hedges are shaped into abstract birds and probably one terrified squirrel. She's quiet for a moment, then says, "You've changed things, you know." You blink. "Me?" She nods. "You arrived neutral. A non-combatant. But you listened. You participated. You resisted judgment without resisting curiosity. You stare at a particularly large topiary that may or may not be a swan. I think," she adds, "that's how peace begins. Not with winning, but with observing." You sit on a low stone bench. A bee lands on a daisy with terrifying precision. Then she leans in conspiratorially and says, "Also, your embroidery was the only one that didn't include tears, which is, frankly, a miracle." You laugh. And for a while, you just sit. No peas. No forks. Just birdsong and breeze. Dinner that night is relaxed, more grazing than formality. Cold meats, cheeses, a shockingly competent blackberry pie. You find yourself seated between Ambrose and a woman who claims to have once dined opposite the Queen's corgi handler. She ate peas with a straw, the woman says matter-of-factly. Said it saved time? Ambrose nearly chokes on his cheddar. After dessert, the evening dissolves into music and card games. The air is rich with harmony. Even Pexley wins a round of cribbage, though no one's entirely sure how. You retreat to the library for a moment alone and discover a new volume on the side table, the P Anthology, selected writings from the manor years. It's handmade, bound in soft green leather. Inside are notes, sketches, anecdotes, even embroidered swatches. You flip to the final page. There, in careful script, "To our guest, whose spoon was steady, whose mind was open, and whose presence reminded us that the smallest things can carry the biggest stories. May your peas always roll gently." The house. You close the book. and realize, with a strange kind of softness, that this has become more than a visit. It's become a chapter. One that began with a rolling pea and somehow unraveled into reflection, absurdity, connection, and grace. As you walk the quiet halls toward bed, you hear Finchley humming. You see Lavinia's notebook resting on a windowsill with a pressed pea tucked inside. And you know. Tomorrow, the peas may return in a new form. Or not at all. But either way, you'll be ready. By now, you move through the manor like someone who has lived several lifetimes in its corridors. Each creak of the floorboard is familiar, each oil painting a friend with an opinion. You know where the tea is kept. You know which window seat gets the best morning light. You know that Pexley always sneezes twice before speaking. These are the quiet things that tether a person to a place, not grand gestures, but repetition wrapped in affection. The next day begins with a handwritten invitation slid under your door. The Grand Pea Reconciliation Ceremony, Rose Ballroom, noon. Strict dress code, something with meaning. Optional, a pea. You stare at it for a moment, then smile. Naturally. Something with meaning. You open the wardrobe and consider your options. You land on a waistcoat embroidered with vines, not actual pea plants, but they're close enough. You find a green handkerchief, folded into a pocket triangle, and add a single dried pea in the center. A boutonniere of memory. The Rose Ballroom, when you arrive, is transformed. Sunlight streams through tall windows. Tables encircle the perimeter, each topped with artifacts from the week, embroidery hoops, illustrated pea scrolls, half-sketched menus, spoons with personal backstories. A trio plays something light on the harpsichord. The mood is not solemn, it's celebratory, but gentle. A victory parade without the bragging. Guests enter in a slow trickle. Finchley wears a cravat patterned with miniature spoons. Lavinia sports a pea-green ribbon around her. The center of the room is open. At its heart, a glass pedestal. On it, resting atop a velvet pillow the color of overcooked asparagus, sits a single pea. Just one. The final pea. The room settles into silence as Ambrose clears his throat, steps forward, and unrolls a parchment. Dearly beloved, he begins in his best imitation of ecclesiastical authority. We are gathered here today to honor the journey of a legume who brought us together, tore us apart, and taught us, above all, the value of perspective. There are muffled chuckles. He continues. It began, as these things do, with an innocent question, how should one eat peas? And like all innocent questions, it revealed everything. Our habits. Our history. Our hunger for meaning in small, round places. Lavinia dabs her eyes with her ribbon. Finchley nods solemnly. We debated. We scoffed. We judged. We fainted, thank you, Pexley. And in the end, we learned that there is no singular way. Only choices. And intentions. And the occasional spoon. He steps back. And the room breathes. Next, Pennington approaches. She doesn't read. She doesn't need to. She simply places her brooch next to the pea, gives a soft nod, and says, forgiven. No one moves to clarify what or whom she's forgiving. It doesn't matter. Then, Lady Chanter produces a tiny bell from her handbag and rings it once, sharply. This, she says, is tradition now. And with that, the music picks up. People begin to circulate. Tiny pea-themed canapes are passed, pea puree on crackers, pea-sized shortbread, green tea macarons. You accept a plate and join Lavinia by the window. It's all so poetic, she says. You nod. A bit ridiculous. Of course. But aren't most worthwhile things? You both watch as Finchley presents his final sketch of the week, a spoon resting in a field, beneath a sky made entirely of peas. It's called Reunion. Around the room, the mood shifts from ceremony to ease. Guests settle into armchairs. Conversations drift like petals, light, fragrant, impossible to pin down. Someone finds a chessboard and plays silently, using green beans as pawns. Someone else starts a whispered game of Guess the Cutlery origin story. Then Ambrose sidles up beside you with a peculiar grin. Would you care, he says, for one last game? You follow him into a side room. There, laid out on a velvet cloth, is the Manor's infamous game, the Pea Protocol. Fork-shaped tokens. Dice carved like tiny root vegetables. Cards titled Table Dilemmas and Sauce Emergencies. You take your seat. Lavinia joins, then Finchley, Pennington, and even a slightly hesitant Pexley, now armed with a brace for his artistic injuries. You roll the dice. A card is drawn. You've misjudged the angle and launched 3 peas into the Duchess's lap. Do you A. Pretend it was an interpretive performance? B. Blame the draft? C. Offer her a spoonful of creme brulee and change the subject? You all laugh. The game plays out in soft chaos. Ambrose pretends to swoon dramatically. Pennington engineers an elaborate utensil heist. Pexley wins after playing a moral high ground card at the perfect moment, though no one is quite sure how it works. You finish the game feeling lighter. The room is warm with camaraderie, and the air smells faintly of bergamot and well-earned absurdity. As evening falls, the manor begins to quiet. One by one, guests retreat to rooms, alcoves, and balconies. You find yourself on the back terrace, watching the last light of day brush the tops of the trees, and then it stops. Perfectly still. Perfectly fine. The final morning arrives with a hush so gentle it almost forgets to exist. No bells. No bustling trays. Even the usual murmurs in the corridor seem to tiptoe today, as if the manor itself knows something is ending. You wake slowly, not because you're particularly tired, but because getting up means admitting that this chapter is closing. The familiar creak of the floorboard underfoot feels unusually poignant, like an old friend saying "Don't forget me." Your window is fogged slightly, blurring the hedges and making the sun look softer than it is. You dress without fuss, no embroidery today, no symbolic lapel piece. Just you, as you are. Downstairs, the breakfast room is quieter than usual. The long table holds fewer guests. Some have already slipped away early, avoiding the weight of goodbyes. Those who remain are subdued, not sad, but thoughtful. Even Pexley, nursing a final pot of marmalade tea, seems unusually calm. He gives you a small salute with his toast, which you return with a dignified nod. Lavinia appears wearing a robe that looks suspiciously like it was stolen from one of the guest bathrooms. She has no shame about it. I thought, she says, sitting beside you, that the last breakfast would feel ceremonial. It's almost better that it doesn't, you reply. Makes it real. Exactly, she says, and pops a grape in her mouth like a punctuation mark. The plates today are simple: poached eggs, fresh fruit, a few remaining buttery scones that Finchley has started referring to as existential carb units. And of course, a modest spoonful of peas, delicate, unannounced, either hero nor villain. You eat them without thinking. Not because they've lost their meaning, but because they've finally become just food again. After breakfast, Pennington rises with the careful purpose of someone preparing a closing speech. She does not disappoint. Friends, she says, standing at the head of the table with her usual theatrical posture, we arrived as strangers. Some of us leave as tolerated acquaintances. A few, perhaps, as co-conspirators. There's a ripple of laughter. We've debated the undebatable, balanced the unbalanceable. And in doing so, we've come closer to something that, if not truth, is at least a very good metaphor. She raises a glass of grapefruit juice, which somehow feels dignified. To the table. May it always be round enough for everyone to be wrong in harmony. You raise your own glass, and so does everyone else, and for a fleeting moment, you wonder if this kind of bizarre, heartfelt nonsense is exactly what civilization is built upon. After breakfast, a few guests depart quietly. Ambrose leaves first, his luggage transported in a carriage that looks suspiciously too small for someone with 5 travel capes. He bows deeply before leaving, then mutters something about forkless deserts and vanishes. Lady Chanter exits next, her heels never once catching on the gravel path. She leaves behind a calling card that simply reads, "You may quote me. But do so well." Even Finchley is packing. He offers you one final sketch, a single pea nestled in the curve of a sleeping cat's paw. It's titled Permission to Rest, he says. Or maybe Don't Wake the Legume. I haven't decided. You take it with genuine gratitude. The house staff begins collecting left-behind items, abandoned fans, forgotten hats, one monogrammed napkin with a small embroidered P and the words "Never Again" stitched in gold. Lavinia finds you in the drawing room, curled up with a final cup of Earl Grey and a biscuit that seems to be made mostly of butter and divine intervention. "Will you write about this?" she asks. "Maybe," you say. "But who would believe it?" "That's not the point," she says. "It's not about belief. It's about remembering." At midday, the manor holds a soft farewell, not a formal goodbye, but an invitation to gather in the garden one last time, with chairs placed in a lazy spiral and tea served from mismatched pots. There are no speeches, only the occasional shared glance, the lift of a teacup, and the hum of shared memory. You wander the garden paths, pausing at the hedge shaped like a lopsided duck. You pass the stone bench where Lavinia once said something vaguely philosophical, and likely made up. You stop by the sundial where someone had scrawled "Peas forever" in chalk, now half erased by dew. Near the back of the garden is a low wooden box. A little sign reads, "The Pea Repository. Leave what you no longer need. Take what reminds you who you are." Inside, a single spoon, a sketch, a poem written on a serviette, a miniature embroidery of a fork that looks like it's dancing. You place your Finchley sketch inside and whisper, "Thank you." Then you take a folded card that simply reads, "You were never the only one who wasn't sure." And somehow, that feels like enough. As you walk back toward the manor, the light shifts in that sleepy, late afternoon way where everything feels slightly sepia-toned. You pass the kitchen and smell bread, lavender, and lemon. Someone's baking something to mark the end, or perhaps just because it's Tuesday. You hear the faint notes of the cello again, same player, same sorrow-tinged waltz that had played at the garden luncheon. This time, it feels like a lullaby. You return to your room one last time. Your suitcase sits ready. On the bed is a small wrapped bundle, a green velvet pouch containing 3 silver peas. There's a note. "Take these. For when you forget what small things can do." It isn't signed. It doesn't need to be. You hold the peas in your hand, cool and smooth and strangely weighty. And in them, you feel every awkward silence, every silent judgment, every burst of laughter, every knowing glance, every ridiculous technique, and every delicious absurdity that somehow made this week one of the most memorable of your life. You slip the pouch into your pocket. And with one final glance at the window, at the fog-drenched world beyond, at the manor that turned a vegetable into a voyage, you step out the door. The house does not creak goodbye. But you feel it. In your bones. In your breath. And in that one piece still balanced on the edge of memory. The carriage waiting outside is the same one that brought you here, though it feels like another lifetime entirely. Its brass trim gleams faintly in the mid-morning mist, and the driver gives you the sort of nod that implies he has seen everything and will never speak of it again. You place your bag inside and settle into the cushions, still warm from the sun. There's a wool blanket draped over the seat, one of those little manner touches that feels like a wink. Tucked into the folds is a napkin embroidered with a single green dot, and the words "Try again tomorrow." You smile. The wheels crunch softly over the gravel path as the manor recedes behind you. Its ivy-covered facade seems to bow slightly, a stately farewell from a building that has housed generations of very particular, very passionate people who all, at one time or another, took a deep breath before scooping a spoonful of peas. The trees lining the drive sway gently, their leaves performing a slow, rustling applause. Or maybe that's just your imagination. Either way, it feels earned. As the carriage rolls past the final curve, you think back through the week in odd fragments, moments that now feel stitched together like a story quilt. Pennington's arched eyebrow, Finchley's existential carb unit, Pexley's dramatic tumbles, Lavinia's whispered epiphanies over lemon tarts. And the peas, of course. Always the peas. Not just on plates, but in conversation, in metaphors, in arguments and dreams and desperate attempts at elegance. You realize now how much time was spent circling them, like moons orbiting a tiny, green planet. Historians still argue whether etiquette is about control or communication. Some say it's a weapon. Others call it a dance. But perhaps it's just a language we haven't finished translating, one where a spoon can mean surrender and a fork can mean war, and the absence of either is a kind of vulnerable poetry. The carriage passes through the gates, wrought iron curling like question marks. Beyond them, the road opens wide and unadorned. Trees give way to open fields, the landscape stretching like a held breath. You lean your head against the window, and in the rhythm of the carriage wheels, you start to trace the real arc of the week, not just the events, but the transformation. The way the manor shaped you, or maybe revealed you. You arrived as an observer, a guest among titans of tradition and eccentricity. You watched, unsure whether to engage or just survive. But slowly, through lavender notes and late-night conspiracies, you became part of the rhythm. Not by force. Not by mimicry. But by presence. You didn't pick a side. You picked a spoon. And somehow, that was enough. You remember that quiet moment on the terrace when Lavinia asked how you'd remember it. And now, in this leaving, you have your answer. You'll remember it not as the weak people argued over peas, but as the weak people let themselves be seen, awkward, opinionated, imperfect, brilliant, and found that no single method of eating peas could capture that whole, wild spectrum of humanness. You pull the green pouch from your coat pocket and open it. 3 silver peas, smooth as river stones, rest quietly in your palm. You imagine planting one, not in soil, but in conversation. Dropping it gently into a discussion. Offering it like a mirror. Letting it roll. You chuckle softly, startling the driver just enough to make his hat tilt forward. He adjusts it without turning around. The unspoken rule remains: whatever happens in the carriage stays in the carriage. Up ahead, a little village appears. Cobbled streets. A bakery with smoke curling from the chimney. Children chasing each other with stick swords. A woman in a bonnet balancing far too many apples. You spot a market stall selling pea shoots in tiny brown paper bundles. The carriage slows to pass through. And you feel it again, that tug. That sense that the world is full of tiny, ordinary things trying their best to mean something. You imagine striking up a conversation at the bakery counter. Yes, quite fresh. A hint of mint, perhaps. But tell me, how do you eat them? And the baker, confused but polite, might reply, with a fork, of course. Like a normal person. And you'd nod, smile, and say, ah, but is it ever really that simple? The village fades behind you, and the road stretches on. There's still a long way to go. But it doesn't feel long. Because now you carry the story with you. Not in facts or timelines, not in recipes or etiquette manuals, but in tone, in texture, in a way of seeing. You see the small things now. You see how they ripple. And how, even in the quietest, most ridiculous corners of history, people have always tried to connect, to impress, to belong, to make meaning out of what was available. Even if what was available was a bowl of slightly overcooked peas. You look out the window one last time and whisper, not for anyone, just for yourself, thank you. And somewhere, deep in the velvet-swathed memory of the manor, a single pea tips off a silver spoon and rolls, unbothered, into legend. The road eventually deposits you at a modest station house tucked between 2 hills, its wooden beams sun-warmed and humming softly in the breeze. The platform is quiet, just the conductor drinking tea and a cat asleep on a schedule board that hasn't been updated in a decade. You step down from the carriage. The driver gives you a polite nod, no words, no farewell, and clicks the reins once. The carriage rolls away, leaving you with the hush of open space and the smell of distant lavender. There's no rush to board. You take a seat on a nearby bench, its paint flaking like a memory that's been sat on too often. You set your bag beside you and loosen your collar. The air is easy here. You could almost pretend you've always belonged in this moment. Inside your coat pocket, the velvet pouch feels warm against your side. You don't open it again. You don't need to. You know the weight of those silver peas by heart now, the quiet message they carry, the unassuming reminder. Other passengers trickle onto the platform. A couple in travel-wrinkled linen. An older woman with a wide-brimmed hat and a dog the size of a teacup. A boy holding a toy train in one hand and a sandwich in the other, clearly unsure which is more valuable. None of them know where you've been. None of them know what you've seen. And that's fine. Because you do. The train arrives without fanfare, a low, steady glide of steel and steam. The conductor tips his cap. You rise, step aboard, and choose a seat by the window. As the train pulls away, you watch the platform recede, the hills lean back, and the skies stretch wider than it needs to. The rhythm of the rails lulls you, not into sleep, but into stillness. The kind that comes after a story ends, when the echoes are still curling around your chest. You turn your thoughts over gently, like well-worn stones. Each moment at the manor flashes back in soft loops, Pennington's micro-expressions, Finchley's wandering brush, Lavinia's thoughtful tangents, Pexley's perpetual chaos. You smile. And underneath it all, the peas. Green, round, defenseless. And yet, look at what they stirred. Historians still argue whether culinary customs are a window into the soul of a society, or simply its dressing room mirror. But what they often forget is that food doesn't just nourish, it performs. It reassures. It gives us a script when we've forgotten our lines. A spoon lifted in silence. A fork laid down in surrender. A pea balanced and offered like an olive branch. On this train, no one is arguing. No one is comparing fork technique or spiral placements. And yet, the tension of your week-long theatrical experience lingers like the scent of roasted garlic in an empty kitchen. You breathe in. And let it go. You imagine where everyone is now. Finchley, probably halfway through a new series titled Legume Fantasias, Volume 2. Lavinia, embroidering some new ambiguous sentiment onto a pillow, maybe stabs softly or manners are just stubborn whispers. Pexley, undoubtedly caught in another accidental scandal involving celery and a monocle. And Pennington? You picture her in the garden, gloves off, holding a tiny trowel and speaking to the earth with that imperious, oddly gentle tone she reserves for things that can't argue back. You smile again. The train ride is long but light. The scenery shifts gently. Hedges give way to fields, then forests, then rooftops. You pass towns with names that sound like sneezes or ancient spellings of oregano. You begin to feel the gravity of normal life returning. You reach into your satchel and pull out a notebook. Not to write a tell-all. Not to compose a memoir titled My Week Among the Pea People. Just to record a feeling. You write a single sentence on the first page. A pea may be small, but in good company, it becomes a planet. You close the notebook and tuck it away. The city nears. You recognize its shape. Buildings that lean in, roads that curve like question marks, the buzz of people moving not out of joy but habit. You'll step off the train and melt back into the landscape, another figure on a pavement. But you'll be different. You'll carry the manor with you, not on your shoulders, but stitched somewhere inside your voice, your laughter, the way you set a table, the way you notice how someone holds a spoon when they think no one's watching. You'll never look at peas the same way again. But more importantly, you'll never look at small things the same way. Not the little gestures. Not the quiet disagreements. Not the routines we cling to for meaning when the world is too wide, too fast. Because you've seen how something as absurdly insignificant as a boiled vegetable can build community. How a simple question, how do you eat that, can open 100 doors into identity, history, ego, and hope. You've seen how absurdity can lead to grace. And how, sometimes, a single, unassuming moment, done thoughtfully, can be enough to hold an entire room still. The train slows. Your station nears. You stand, gather your bag, and prepare to step off. You feel no need to rush. Outside the window, the platform waits. Someone's child is swinging from a lamppost. A dog chases its tail beside an unattended suitcase. Life, unbothered by metaphors, is still rolling. But you understand something now. You understand that the quietest revolutions don't come with banners or speeches. Sometimes, they arrive with silver cutlery. A velvet pouch. and the courage to ask, what if we tried it this way, just once? And now, as the story closes like a well-worn recipe book, you feel the warmth of it settle around you, like the hush that follows a long dinner party, where the candles have burned low and the chairs have grown too comfortable to leave. You are full, not of food, but of something gentler, something quieter. A sense that, in the right company, even the smallest things, peas, manners, laughter, little arguments over cutlery, can become entire worlds of meaning. Not because they're grand, but because they're shared. You breathe deeply. The air is soft now. The kind of air that remembers teacups and linen and the sound of shoes on old wood floors. The kind that holds the faint echo of someone's laughter 3 rooms away. Your body loosens. Your thoughts grow slower, wider, like sleepy boats on a quiet lake. You smile at the memory of spoons held like dueling swords, of embroidery hoops filled with nonsense, of pea-puree declarations and whispered apologies over pudding. None of it mattered, really. And yet, it did. Because it reminded you that we're all just trying to belong, to impress, to be understood. Sometimes with words, sometimes with forks, sometimes just with presence. So now, let your shoulders sink. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breath deepen. You are safe. You are enough. And somewhere out there, in some forgotten drawer or velvet pouch, a tiny silver pea glows quietly, waiting to remind you of all the strange, beautiful, gently ridiculous ways we try to be human. Sleep well. You've earned it.